Are you ready to learn 3D modeling in Blender? Hey guys, in this free Blender course, I've compiled and reorganized my 3D modeling for absolute beginners video series into this one video, and I've added a few things in just to make this course easy for you guys to follow, so you can get started with Blender and learn the essential 3D modeling tools with ease. In this course, we're going to be covering mastering the basics through episodes 1 to 4. In this one, we will learn how to navigate in Blender, moving, rotating, and changing the size of objects, how to select and use the toolbar in Blender, and more essential knowledge to get you started. Then we'll be going over the 3D modeling fundamentals from episodes 5 through to 20. Here we'll get started with 3D modeling and go in depth with essential hotkeys and 3D modeling tools. These are ones that you'll be using all the time when 3D modeling inside of Blender, so they're really important to know about. Then we'll be putting all of these new skills into practice by quad modeling a basic table through episodes 21 to 22. We'll also be adding some realistic edges to our table using a cool modifier in Blender. Finally, to wrap up this course, we'll be learning more of the awesome modeling tools inside of Blender through episodes 23 to 28. This will take your Blender knowledge a cut above other new Blender users and get you ready for tackling unique modeling projects. Apart from that though, let's go ahead and jump into the course. Enjoy! Today we're going to be learning how to navigate in Blender as the first installment in my new series for absolute Blender beginners to get them familiar with 3D modeling in Blender whilst building a good fundamental knowledge so you actually know what you're doing when you're modeling in Blender. The first installments in this series may be a little bit basic for a lot of my viewers, but I promise that later on in the course we will go over some more interesting tips and stuff, so make sure to stick around if you're interested in that as well. As I mentioned, today we're going to be learning about basic navigation. So to start off, if we want to move around our scene, we can just hold down the middle mouse button by pressing it with your finger and then moving your mouse. You can see this way I can move around the viewport. If you don't have a middle mouse button, you can left click and hold this gizmo here, and as you move your mouse whilst left clicking and holding, you can see I'm rotating around the 3D viewport. That's not the only way to move though. We can also hold down the shift key and then use the middle mouse button, and you can see this is going to allow me to what we call pan, which pretty much allows us to move left and right and up and down without any rotational movement. Again, if you can't use your middle mouse button, you can left click this hand icon and it's going to do the exact same thing. So I just left click and hold and move my mouse and it's going to move like that. Next up, if you want to zoom in or zoom out, you can just scroll the wheel on your mouse and that's just going to allow us to zoom in and out. If you don't have a scroll wheel, you can use this zoom icon here by just left clicking and holding it on the right here, and that's going to allow us to zoom in and out. If you can't see any of these icons, do keep in mind that this button here might be off. To turn it back on, we just need to make sure this show gizmo button is blue. At the bottom here, we have an option called switch the current view from perspective to orthographic, and when I left click that, you can see everything goes a little bit more distorted. I'll left click it again to go back to perspective, and I'm going to press Shift A, and this is going to allow us to add objects into our scene. So you can see it's add, so you can think of it as Shift A for add. Then under mesh, I'm going to choose cube. You might have one of these in your scene by default. Again, if I want to navigate, I can just use my middle mouse button like this. But when I change this mode to orthographic, you can see it will make our object look a little bit different. Another button you might notice here is this camera button. And this is only applicable if you have a camera in your scene. When I left click this button, you'll see nothing will happen because I don't have a camera in my scene. Speaking of which, how can we tell what we have in our scene? If you come up to the top right hand corner, you can see we have this thing called the outliner. And it shows all the different types of objects, elements we have in our scene. Do keep in mind some of them may be hidden by this little arrow button, in which case you can left click it to open up more information. You may have a camera already in your scene, but since I don't, I'm going to open the add menu again by pressing shift and then A, and then this time I'm going to choose camera by left clicking, and that has added a camera into our scene. Something you'll notice as well, if I press G, which is the grab key, and move it, is everything is added into the center of the world. But it's not actually determined by the center of the world, it's determined by this 3D cursor. If you want to learn about moving this 3D cursor, it's a little bit more advanced, so I'm going to be putting this into the 6th installment in this series. But it is a video I already have if you want to check it out. Now when I press this camera button, you can see it's going to go into my camera view. You'll also notice that in my outliner here, we have our camera and our cube. In the next video, we're going to be learning about how we can move, scale and rotate our objects in Blender. Today, in this series of modeling for beginners, we're going to be learning how we can move, scale and rotate our objects inside of Blender. First of all, if we want to select our object, I'm going to make sure I'm in object mode, which is this button up at the top here, and I'm going to left click the object which I want to move. you'll notice how a highlight will come around our object like this, which means it's selected. Moving our objects in Blender is very simple, as I covered it briefly in the last tutorial. To do it, we just press G, and you can think of it as G for grab, as I'm grabbing hold of this object, and then when I move my mouse, you can see the object moves with it. The only problem with this though is if I press G to grab it and then move it over here, for example, you can see how things might get a little bit difficult to position in 3D space. I'll press Ctrl Z, which is our undo command, to return it to the center. First of all, if we want to grab something, we can choose a specific axis in order to move it across. If an axis sounds scary, don't worry, it's actually very simple. This green line, for example, is our y-axis, and if you ever forget, just look at this little gizmo here. You can see it labels which color means what. We also have a red line here, which represents the x-axis, which you can see is going this way here. And we have a z-axis, which we can't actually see a line for in the viewport, but is going up and down, as indicated by this gizmo here. There is actually a way to turn on the z-axis in the viewport if you would like to. To do that, you can just come up to these two circles here, left click the arrow, and turn on Z in the axes button. Now, how can we actually go about moving our object on one of these axes, and why is it useful? Well, the main reason it's useful is because it's a little bit easier to understand how we're moving something in 3D space that way. So let's try and move it on the y-axis first, which is that green line there. To do that, all I need to do is press G for grab, and then I'm going to choose Y, which is going to allow me to move it across the y-axis. Notice after I've pressed Y, the green line has become brighter, indicating that it's now moving across that green axis. I'll move it over to here, and when I'm satisfied with its position, I can just press left click. Again, if you want to return it to the last position, you can just press Ctrl and then Z to return it. You can also, if I press G and then Y again, and I'm not happy with this position and want to return it, but without left clicking to position it first, I can press right click just to immediately return it to where it was. This only works while you're still deciding where you're positioning your object while moving it. And this will work with rotate and scale as well. Scale is just changing the size of the object. Let's try and move it across the x-axis this time. I recommend pausing the video and trying to guess for yourself how it would work. If you guessed that it was pressing G and then X, you're correct. That will allow us to move it across the x-axis. Then, of course, as you might have guessed, if we press G and then Z, we can now move it along this blue axis as well. I'll press right click to return. That's handy to know, but what if I want to move it across two axes at the same time? For example, maybe I want to move my object over to here where my mouse is, but I don't want it to go up and down while I do it. Well, to do that, I could move it on only the X and Y axis. And to do that, we need to exclude a certain axis from our movement. I'll press G, and rather than choosing one of my axes and moving it one at a time, I can press Shift Z, and you'll notice how both the red and the green line have become brighter. And what Shift Z does is it's pretty much saying move it on all of the axes apart from Z. And now if I move it over here and then rotate, you'll notice it hasn't moved up and down at all. This of course will work with any combination. For example, if we only want to move it on the green line and the blue line, and we need to think about what we would press. If you guess that we would press G and then Shift X, because we're excluding that red line, which is the x-axis, you're correct. We can then move it here and press left click, and notice how it hasn't moved on the x-axis at all. I recommend playing about with moving your object, and then once you're comfortable with moving your objects, we'll move on to rotation. To rotate, all we need to do is press R with our object selected, and you can see that's going to allow us to rotate our object like this. If you press R again, that's going to allow you to have a little bit more control over our rotation. So R for basic rotation, and you can press R again, or you can think of it as pressing R twice for a little bit more of an easier time while rotating. I'll right click and then I'm going to press Ctrl Z to return its rotation. If I want to rotate it in, let's say, this direction here, so spinning in its center like that, we can press R and then Z, and that's going to allow me to rotate it around the Z axis. This of course will work with your other axes, so I can press R and then X, and that's going to allow me to spin around this red line here. I want you to think about how we would get it to spin around the green line. If you guess that would be R and then Y, you're correct. You can of course rotate on only the Y and X axis by pressing R and then Shift and then Z, and that's going to only allow you to rotate across this X and Y axis, which ironically is actually going to make it so it only spins on the blue axis. But that's just the nature of how rotation works, so don't stress on it too much. Let's say though I rotate my object a bunch, and I've done a bunch of other actions and I can't press Ctrl Z to return it to its default. Thankfully, there's some built-in tools to help you with both resetting rotation, scale, and movement. To reset rotation, all I need to do is hold down the Alt key and then press R. And you can see that that's now reset the rotation. So think of it as Alt for reset. I can also do this for my grab as well, so I can press Alt and then G, and you'll notice it's now going to return it to the center where it first originated. If you know what applying the scale, rotation, or location is in Blender, once you do this, that will become the new resetted point. If applying transforms is a new concept to you, please ignore that previous statement for now. Finally, let's talk a little bit about scale. Scale is pretty much just adjusting the size of an object. If I press S, you'll notice it's going to allow me to make my object bigger or smaller as I move my mouse. Again, we can choose a certain axis to scale our object on. So I could press S and then Z, for example, to make it taller on just that Z axis. I can also press S and then X to scale it on just that X axis. And I can also exclude a certain axis, so I could press S and then Shift Z, and that would allow me to scale it on just the X and Y axis. And if we want to return our object to its default scale, you can press Alt and then S to return it like that. The final thing I want to talk about is how we can rotate, scale and move things a little bit slower, which is good for getting some precision. So if I press the G key and move my object, right now you can see it's moving quite fast as I move my mouse. But if I want to do this slower, I can hold down Shift while doing this, and you'll notice that I have to drag my mouse a lot more to move my object. This may be annoying in some cases, but very handy in others. So it's useful to keep this option in mind for a little bit more flexibility while modeling or just moving your objects in general. And as I mentioned, if I press S and then hold down Shift, this will work with scale as well, and of course rotation. But yeah, that just about covers the basics of transforming objects in object mode in Blender. Transforming is just that rotation, scale, and grab that I was talking about. Today we're going to be discussing this thing on the left here called the toolbar, and also the different types of selection we can do in the 3D viewport in object mode. To start off, let's add a few objects. So I'm going to press Shift A, which as we know is our add menu, and under mesh I'm going to choose cube. Then I'll press Shift A again, and under mesh I'm going to choose cylinder, and I'll press G and X, which as you know will grab it on the X axis so we can move it along like this. If you're not sure how to move objects in Blender, make sure to check out the previous tutorial where I cover this more in depth. Then I'm going to cover a new command today for objects, which is called the duplicate command. To do this, all I need to do is with my object selected, so I'll left click it, I can press Shift, hold it, and then press D, and that's going to allow me to duplicate my object like this. And then I can press G and then X again, just to move it along the X axis. And there we are, now we have a few objects to play around with. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the toolbar today. First of all, if your toolbar is hidden, you can press the T key on your computer, which will toggle it on or off. You'll also notice when it's hidden that there's a little arrow here, which you can click to open it as well. Let's start from the top, which is this option called Select Box. This is the default in Blender, and it pretty much means when you left click and hold, a box is going to appear, which will allow you to select everything inside of the box. Notice how when I bring my box over these two objects, they both become selected. You notice one of them has a brighter highlight here, and another one has a more dim orange highlight. The brighter highlight, which may be a bright yellow or like a white like this, is the active selected object. The orange one is selective, but isn't the active selected object. This isn't really important for now, but I thought I'd let you know just to get you familiar with that information early. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a later tutorial. Another thing to note is when you have multiple selected objects, you can actually edit them at the same time. So if I was to left click this object mode option and change to edit mode, you can see both of these objects will go into edit mode. To come out of edit mode, I'll just press tab on my computer, or you can select it from up here again. If I left click and hold this select box, you can see we have a few different options. The tweak option will allow you to left click and drag to move objects like this. So I can left click and then I can left click and hold my selected object, and that's going to allow me to move it around like this. I'll left click and hold this option again, and next we have select circle. This will allow me to select things which I want using a brush motion. You'll notice though, when I brush over these that nothing's getting selected, and that's because we need to kind of hit the center of our object with this tool. So I'm going to aim for, you see where this white dot is? That is the origin point, which is roughly the center of the object. I'm going to want to hit roughly that point on all these objects. So I'll left click and drag, and you can see if I kind of hit that center point, it's going to select them nicely. In the top left hand corner, there's a radius option, and if I increase the size of my radius, you can see I've now got a bigger brush, which will allow me to probably select things a little bit easier. Then we got select lasso, and what this does is I'm just going to left click anywhere else in my scene to deselect everything, and now when I left click and hold, you can see that's going to select everything within this drawn area. Now I'm going to left click and go back to my select box, which is my default. I'm also going to cover a couple of hotkeys as well. First of all, if we want to quickly access the circle select tool but not change it here, you can press the C key, and that's going to allow you to access the circle tool. Then when you're done, you can just right click and it will disappear. Next up, we have these options up here, which are the type of selection we have. So right now we're on the set a new selection mode, which pretty much means if I left click and drag to box like this, then left click and drag to box like this, you can see it's going to replace the selection each time. However, if I change it to extend existing selection, notice now when I left click and drag to box select, both of these are now selected. So this is almost like adding to your selection, and it won't reset it each time. You've also got subtract as well, and as you might expect, when I left click and hold to drag, it's now going to remove that from the selection. These two at the end here I don't really tend to use, but you can play around with them if you would like. Also, there's a few selection hotkeys that are useful to know, and you'll end up using them when you're modeling as well. So the first one, if you want to select everything in your scene, you can press A, and I like to think of it as A for all. If you want to deselect everything, you can just press Alt A. So remember how Alt R and Alt G were resetting rotation and location? You can think of Alt A as resetting selection. So we're going back to the default, which is with nothing selected. So Alt A to deselect everything. Then of course, as you know, when we left click an object, it's going to select them. But what if we want to select multiple at once without using the box select or anything like that? Well, we can hold down the shift key and then we can left click, and you'll now notice that I can now select multiple objects just using the left click. Of course, when you have multiple objects selected, if I press G for example to grab, you'll notice I can move all my objects at the same time. Next up on our toolbar we have this cursor option, and I actually have a video already on the 3D cursor, and I'm going to add it to the playlist for around episode 6 in this series. But if you want to check it out just now, you're more than welcome to. Next up we have this move option, and this works just like our grab command. So if I left click one of my objects, you can see these axes will appear, and some people prefer to use this rather than the grab command. So to use this is very simple. You just left click one of the arrows and hold, and that allows you to move objects this way. I can right click to undo that. You also notice there's these squares, and this one for example works like the G and then Shift Z command, which means it's only going to move on the X and Y axis. Then, as you might imagine, next one we have is rotate, which will allow us to rotate our object by left clicking and holding these circular lines. We also have a scale option as well, and this works with these cube looking arrows. I can left click and hold them to scale our object that way. You can also hold down the center to scale the whole thing up like this. Then we have the transform, and this pretty much allows you to transform in every way you like at once. So you see I can scale, and I can rotate, and I can move all with just one tool. I personally prefer using the hotkeys though, as it's a lot quicker. Next up we have this annotate option. When I left click this will bring up a pen, and what this allows me to do is make notes. So I like to use this a lot when I'm doing videos, so I definitely find it a useful tool to have. And I just realized that I made an arrow point to a cube, which is technically a cuboid. Next up we have measure. We won't go too in depth into this because it's a little bit out of the scope of today's tutorial, but essentially what it allows you to do is you can left click and drag with it selected, and you see I can create a measurement in 3D space. Something cool you can do as well is if you left click and drag it and then press one of the axes on your keyboard, so for example Z, you'll notice I can now kind of lock it to up and down, although it tends to be a little bit glitchy. So let's just left click it there. And now when I rotate around my object, you can see this is a line going straight up and down. I can also left click and drag, and then I can hold down X, and if I release, you can see that I've created a straight line across the X-axis too. Next up we have the add cube option. This is a pretty cool tool, just allows you to quickly add things in Blender. So I can left click and hold with this, and you can see it's a yellow square is going to appear. I'm just going to release my mouse here, and after your mouse releases you'll notice I can now drag it up. So I can bring it up and I can choose roughly how big I want my cube to be, so maybe right here, and once I'm satisfied I can just left click. You can see it's created a nice cube for me. If I left click and hold this, you can see we can add a bunch of other what you call primitives in Blender. So I've got a cone, a cylinder, a UV sphere, and an icosphere. Let's try cylinder. So I'll left click and drag, and you can see I can decide the circumference of our cylinder here. Then once I release my mouse, I can just pull it up, and I can decide how tall I want my cylinder to be. I'll left click there, and there we got a nice cylinder. And yeah, that just about covers it. I thought I'd quickly go over the toolbar in Blender and how it can be useful in a few different cases, especially for selection. Today I'm going to be talking about something very quick and simple, but also a little bit of unknown knowledge for beginners, and that's navigating between different menus. You can see that in my current Blender layout I have 1, 2, 3, 4 different menus. So we've got the 3D viewport here, the timeline here, our properties menu here, and our outliner here on the top. Today we're not going to be focusing on what all these different menus do, as you're probably familiar with all the ones you need to for now if you've been following along with this series, but rather I'm going to show you how to change them and how to move them around. So to start simple, let's talk about moving them around. First of all, if I bring my mouse to in between some of these menus, a little arrow will appear. If I left click and hold, you can see I can pull my menus out like this to make them bigger or smaller. This will also work for menus here as well, so I could left click and drag to pull up my timeline. Also, if you want to temporarily zoom into one menu, you can hold down Control and then spacebar with your mouse in the menu, and you'll notice how it's now zoomed into just that menu. If you want to bring it back, all you need to do is come up to the top here where it says back to previous, left click it, and that'll take you back. You can of course do this in any menu, so I'll come to my timeline and press Ctrl spacebar, and now you notice this is the complete focus of my Blender interface. I'll left click back to previous again. Next up, if we want to change a menu, we can left click this button in the very top left hand corner of each menu. So notice how the timeline has a little clock, 3D Viewport has like a sphere in a 3D space, Outliner has like a list of boxes, and Properties menu has these parameter symbols here. So let's go to the very top of the 3D Viewport, and here I can left click it, and you can see I could even change it to the timeline, for example, or I could change it to shader editor, which is how we make materials in Blender, or I could change it to 3D Viewport again. Now bring it back to default. So definitely have a play around with that to get familiar with it. But what if I want to get rid of a certain menu? Unfortunately, if I drag this down, you'll notice it's only going to make that menu really small. So instead what we can do is, if you come to the corner of a menu, you'll notice a little cross will appear. And this cross will allow us to override other menus in Blender. So I can bring my cross to here, for example, in the 3D Viewport. And if I left click and drag, you'll notice that this will allow me to overwrite this menu. So I'll bring it down like this, and now you can see that my timeline is gone. I could also do the same with the Properties menu, for example. I could left click and hold here, and if I drag it up, I can override my outliner here too. And if I wanted to just have the Properties menu, I could left click up here and hold, and then move it along to here. And if I wanted to change this back to 3D Viewport, as you know, you just come up to the top left hand corner, click this button, and change it to the menu you want. So in our case, 3D Viewport. And yeah, that just about covers it. I thought I'd quickly go over that quick but also very important bit of knowledge to know for navigating menus in Blender. And you're bound to encounter some kind of issue where you get stuck and you don't know what to do with the menus, so it's important to cover it on early in your Blender journey. Well done, that's you gone ahead and completed the first section of this course. Some won't even make it this far, so make sure to give yourself a pat on the back for taking your first steps towards becoming a brilliant 3D modeler in Blender. So now you know the basics of using Blender, let's go ahead and start learning the 3D modeling fundamentals. Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about the difference between hard surface and soft surface or organic modeling. First of all, we have hard surface modeling. This is pretty much any object that doesn't change shape or deform, so pretty much objects that you aren't really going to animate with a rig, for example. Some examples of this would be doors, tables, cups, glasses, headphones, so it can still be round objects. But notice how all these objects aren't really objects that you're going to be deforming with a rig, for example. Organic modeling, or soft surface modeling on the other hand, is the process of modeling objects which move. This could be characters, animals, clothes, and things of that nature. It's known as organic modeling since they usually do have a much more organic shape. And that pretty much covers it. Very quick video, but it's important to understand this terminology so you can actually figure out what type of modeler you want to be in Blender. Or heck, maybe you want to learn a skill set for both types of modeling. Today we're going to be going over an introduction to 3D modeling in Blender, where we'll be learning about edit mode, the basics of edit mode selection, and some of the most important modeling tools you're going to use in Blender. To get started, I'm going to left click my default cube and press X and then choose delete. Then I'm going to press Shift A, then under mesh I'm going to choose cube. Now to go into edit mode, we can either come up to the top here and change it from object mode to edit mode, or we can use the handy hotkey tab, which will take us straight into edit mode. Right now you can see all of my object is a kind of shade of orange, and that's because everything here is selected. If I left click away from everything, you'll notice that everything will go to a more kind of grayish color, indicating that it's not selected. Just like in object mode, to select things you just use left click, and right now you can notice I can left click these individual points to select them. This might not be the case for you though, depending on which mode of selection you're on in edit mode, of which there are 3 main types. To see these types, I'll come up to the top beside edit mode, and the first one is vertex select. To do this, you can just press 1 on the keyboard as a hotkey, and that'll take you into vertex mode. Vertex mode will allow you to select these individual points which make up the faces and edges of this object. Then we have the second option, which we press 2 on the keyboard, or we can left click here to go into it, and this will be edge select. This allows me to select an entire edge which is making up these faces of this object. And finally we have face select mode, which we can access by pressing 3 on the keyboard or by left clicking up here, and this will allow us to select the entire faces of our object at a time. As you might have guessed, just like in object mode, we can move, scale and rotate our selections here in edit mode. So I'm going to left click this face here and I'm going to move it across the Y axis by just pressing G and then the Y key to lock it to that Y axis, noticing how that green line has become highlighted, indicating that it's being moved across that axis. When I'm happy with my edit, I can just press left click to save it. If you're confused about axes and haven't watched any of the previous videos in this series, you can see what axes you're working with here with this gizmo in the top. Notice how it shows how the red line here is the x-axis and the green line is the y-axis. And also another axis which isn't being shown with a line in the viewport is the z-axis, which is for up and down. If you're new to moving and rotating things in Blender, I highly recommend checking out this video on moving, rotating and scaling objects in Blender first, as it's pretty much the same concept in edit mode. I can also do this with my edges and my points. So for example, I could go into vertex select mode by pressing 1 on the keyboard, and I could left click one of my points here, and then I could press G to move it or grab it. And you'll notice I can make some pretty significant edits to my object this way. Just like in object mode, you can also select multiple things at the same time. So for example, if I wanted to select these 2 points, I could press shift and then left click this point here. And now when I press G, you will notice that it's going to move both these points at the same time. Just like in object mode, if you're unhappy with your movement and you want to reset it, you can right click while you're moving it to reset it. And of course you have the Control Z command to undo things as well. Now I'm going to go over some common hotkeys that you'll use while editing in Blender. And in the next video, we're going to go more into depth of the selection techniques. So I'm going to press 3 on the keyboard to go into face select mode, and I'm just going to left click this face around the back here. One of the most common things you will do in Blender is extrude a face. What extruding does is it's essentially pulling out a new set of faces from one face, or it could also be from a set of vertices or edges as well. With my face selected, I'm just going to press E, and you can see that's going to pull out a new set of faces like that. Like I mentioned, you can do this with vertices and edges as well. So if I press 1 on the keyboard to go into vertex select mode, I can left click a vertex here and press E, and you can see that's going to allow me to pull out a new vertex. I could also press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode, select an edge, and press E to pull out some edges that way. This is getting pretty messy, so I'm just going to delete everything and start again. So I'll press tab to go into object mode again, and with my object selected, with left click, I'm going to press X and then choose delete. Then I'll press shift A to open the add menu again, and I'm going to choose cube again. I'll press tab to go back into edit mode. I'm going to press 3 on the keyboard, and I'm going to select one of my faces, and I'm going to press E again to extrude it out. Next up, I'm going to go into Inset, which is another common command you'll use. What Inset will do is create a face within a face. So if I press I for Inset, you'll notice when I move my mouse, I can now create a new face within this face. And then I can left click it to save it. Then if I wanted to make this go inward, I could press E again. Now allow me to extrude this inward or outward. In this case we'll go inward, and I'll just left click it to save it there. So you can see how quickly we've got a lot more options for creating some different shaped objects. We can also add geometry in more ways by adding loops. So to do this, I'll press Ctrl and then R, and you can see that now when I hover over different parts of my object, a yellow band will appear over my object. Keep in mind, this will only work with quad-based topology. Of course, a lot of you guys are probably quite new, so you probably won't know what I mean by that. But it's something to keep in the back of your mind for now until I talk about it in a later video. When you're happy with where you want to add your new loop, you can just left click to start positioning it, and now you can just move it to where you would like. And once you're happy, you can left click again, and there you have another loop. This might be useful as you could press S to scale it, and now you can see you can start creating a more unique shape. If you want to slide this edge along after positioning it, you can press G twice, so GG, and then now when I move my mouse, you can see it's going to start sliding it along this geometry. Although something that you might find a bit annoying though is if you select away from your edge loop and you want to select it again, I would have to shift left click through all these edges again until I have it again. This is okay for this example, but see if you had an object with a massive loop made up of loads of edges, this could be very time consuming. So instead we can use a command called Alt left click. So I'll left click away to deselect everything, and I'm going to press Alt left click on this edge loop here. And you'll notice it's now going to select the entirety of all the edges, which will really save me some time. As I mentioned, we're going to be going more into depth with selection in the next video. So for now, we're just going to wrap up things there. One thing I want you guys to try do though, is create a cube in Blender or any other primitive such as a cylinder for example, and mess around with the different tools that we've learned about today. Don't stress on getting anything perfect, just try and play around and get familiar with some of the tools that you can remember. Today we learned about E for extrude, I for inset, Control R to add a loop cut, and the edge slide tool, which is just pressing G twice. Today we're going to be talking about the origin point in Blender, what it can be used for, and how it can speed up your workflow in Blender. First of all, to actually see an origin point we need an object, so I'm going to press Shift and then A. Then under Mesh I'm just going to choose Cube. The origin point is just this white dot, or it might be yellow in your case, in the center of our object. If I move my object by pressing G, you will notice how the white dot stays in the center of the object. I like to think of the origin point as almost a reference point for this specific object. In terms of influencing the transforms, which are rotation, location and scale, mainly rotation and scale are affected by by the origin point. To demonstrate this, if I press R to rotate, you'll notice how the object is rotating and it's using that origin point as a reference. The same applies if I press S to scale. You can notice how the object is sizing up and down and it's using that origin point as the reference point. And when I press G to grab and move our object about, the origin will move with our object, but it doesn't really have much of an influence on how it's moved. And that brings us on to how we can actually move our origin. There's a couple of different ways, but the first way I'm going to show you is moving it manually. So I can come up to this options button here in the 3D viewport, and if I left click it, there's an option called affect only origins. If I left click the checkbox, now when I press G, you'll notice that now my origin is moving. So I'll press G and X just to move this along, and I'll maybe pull it all the way to over here. Then I'll left click options again and turn off this option. So yeah, now you can see our origin is all the way out here. And now when I press G, you'll notice nothing will really change when I'm moving my object, but if I rotate it by pressing R, you can see it's using that origin point as a reference to rotate it around. The same will happen as well when I press S to scale. You can see it's going to scale it from that point. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo those changes. Now I'm going to talk about edit mode and object mode and how it affects the origin. Right now we're in object mode, as you can see in the top left hand corner. And when I press G to move my object, you can see the origin point moves with it. However, this is not true in edit mode. If I press tab, which will allow me to go into edit mode, and I'll press A to select all, and then I'll press G to move all my selected faces, you can notice the point will stay still. And now when I press tab to come back into object mode, and press R again, you can notice our point has been moved again. But let's say I've completed a bunch of actions, and now I can't undo to get my origin back in the center. How would I go about fixing this? Well, thankfully it's very easy. With our object selected with left click, I'll then press right click to open up the object menu, and here there's an option called set origin, and here we have a few different options for how we can move our origin. Geometry refers to all of the vertices which make up this object, and origin is of course the origin point we've been talking about. Let's start off with geometry to origin and origin to geometry. Geometry to origin will move the geometry, or all the vertices, to where the origin is currently set, and it will move it in a way in which the origin point will end up in the center of the object. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. The other option is to right click, and then under set origin we can choose origin to geometry. As you might have guessed, that will take that origin point and move it to the center of our object, essentially resetting what we've done. Next up we have origin to 3D cursor. That will move our origin point to this 3D cursor, which is this red and white striped circular cursor thing here. This can be good because we can move the cursor in a few different ways, which will allow us to therefore move the origin in a few different ways as well. Let's talk a little bit about doing that. I'll press tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard, which is going to allow me to go into Vertices select. You can also left click it up here, and then I'm going to choose a point where I want to move my 3D cursor to. So I'll left click this point here. Then I can press Shift S, which is going to open up my cursor moving menu, and I can choose cursor to selected. Then when I press tab to go back into object mode, if I wanted to move my origin to this point, then I could right click set origin and choose origin to 3D cursor, and now you can see our origin is in that top corner. So when we rotate, it's going to rotate it off that point, and when we scale it, it's going to scale it from that point. The origin is only one of many ways to adjust an object though, as up here in the transform pivot point options, we have a few different ways of choosing how we move objects. For example, if I press G to move this object along and change my pivot point to 3D cursor, when I now press R to rotate, it's going to use the 3D cursor instead of the origin. But this is a topic for another video, so for now, I'm going to change it back to the default, which is medium point, which pretty much just uses the origin in our case. Another thing to know about the origin as well is when I press Alt G to return the object to the default location, you'll notice that the origin will go to the center of the world. So that is one thing to keep in mind with the origin point in relation to clearing location. But yeah, that just about covers everything you need to know about the origin point in Blender. This video is part of my series on 3D modeling for absolute beginners, and just now we're going through some of the fundamental concepts before we dive into 3D modeling to give you a good foundation for starting. Next time we're actually going to move on to learning how to use edit mode so we can start modeling some objects. Today, we're going to be learning a bit about the 3D cursor in Blender, what it's used for, and how it can really help speed up your workflow. First of all, if we want to move our 3D cursor, we can hold down the Shift key and then press right click, and you'll notice our 3D cursor will move to wherever we click. Keep in mind though, this works in 3D space, so it might not necessarily show up where you want it to. You can of course left click this button here on the left side panel, and if you click this button here, when you left click, it'll move the cursor as well. So if you forget the hotkey, that's another way to do it. I'll go back to my select box mode, which is the default. There are more ways to move the cursor. First of all, there is the Shift S menu. This will open a pie menu which will allow you to move your cursor in a few different ways. It also allows you to move your selected objects in certain ways as well. You can see here we have cursor to grid, cursor to world origin, cursor to selected, and cursor to active. The main one we want to think about right now is cursor to world origin, which will reset it to the default position. But why is the 3D cursor important in the first place? Well, one thing you'll notice is when I press Shift A to open the add menu, and under mesh I'll choose cube, you can see the cube has been added to where the 3D cursor is. And you'll notice if I press Shift right click to move my cursor and press Shift A again and choose cube, you'll see the cube has now appeared where the 3D cursor is. So that is one of the first applications of the 3D cursor, is deciding where new objects will be created. I'll press X to delete that object, and I'm going to press Shift S and then choose cursor to world origin to put it back to the middle. Now we know roughly what the 3D cursor does by default and how we can move it. Let's talk a little bit about how else it can be useful. First of all, we can actually move it in more different ways. So let's say for example I want to move the cursor to this bottom corner here of this cube. I'll explain why this could be useful in a minute. I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard to go into vertex select mode. You can see now I can select individual points. I'm going to choose this point here, and now I can open up that Shift S menu again, and this time I'm going to choose cursor to selected. That will move the cursor to whatever object or individual point or set of points that we have selected. I'll press tab to come back into object mode. Now we've gone and done that, you might be wondering why this is even useful in the first place. Right now, if I press R to rotate my object, you can see it's rotating around the origin. The origin is that tiny white dot in the middle, and it also has a lot of use cases. An older video of mine covers the origin and how it can be useful if you're interested in watching that too. However, we can actually use this 3D cursor as an anchor point to rotate around as well. So I can, for example, come up to here where it says transform pivot point. You can see we've got a bunch of options here. And the option we're looking for is 3D cursor. If I left click this, I can then press R, and now you'll notice the cube will rotate around the 3D cursor. I'll press tab to go back into edit mode. Another useful application is moving things to that point. So of course you could use the magnet for this as well, but there's multiple ways of doing things in Blender. So I'm going to show you this way too. So I could select this point, for example, and I could move it to where the cursor is. And remember, we had our cursor at where the other point is, which means it will line up perfectly. So with my point selected, I can press Shift S again. Remember how I mentioned that we can move our selections as well using this menu. So I can choose selection to cursor. You can see it's moved that point straight down to the cursor. These tools can be really handy for when you're doing rigging and stuff as well, if you want to line up some bones, as I find the magnet doesn't always work as well with those. Also, since we have this set to transform pivot point at 3D cursor, that means when we scale and things like that, it's going to scale from that point. So you can start to see immediately how this can be quite useful, and it means we don't have to change our origin point as well. So again, giving us a little bit more flexibility. And yeah, that just about covers it. I thought I'd go over some of the useful features with the 3D cursor. If you guys know any more, feel free to let me know in the comment section below, and maybe we can make a part 2 to this video. Hey everyone, today we're going to be learning about the different types of selection in edit mode to expand your Blender modeling skill set. As this one will be quite an extensive list, there is a free PDF guide included which will go over most of the hotkeys you need to know. Today you don't need to worry about trying to memorize everything, but these are more things to start building your familiarity with these different selection types, and you can always refer to them in the PDF guide whenever you get stuck with something. To start off, we're going to actually need an object. So to add an object in Blender, we can just press Shift A, and then under mesh, I'm just going to choose cylinder today. Then to go into edit mode, we just press tab. If you're new to using edit mode in Blender, one of my last tutorials goes over this in more detail to get you started with modeling in Blender. First thing you need to know about selecting things in edit mode is at the top here, as I briefly mentioned in one of my last videos, we have the different types of selection modes. So the first one here, which we can access by pressing 1 on the keyboard or by left clicking this button here, will take us into vertex select mode. Now when I left click one of my points here, you can see I can select these individual points. These points are called vertices, and they are the individual points which make up the edges, which make up the faces of our object. Then with 2 on the keyboard, we can go into edge select mode. And now when I left click, you can see I can select individual edges. Finally, we have 3 on the keyboard, which is face select mode, and that allows us to select individual faces like this. We can also select multiple by holding down the shift key and then left clicking, so now we can select multiple things at once. With that recap out of the way, let's move on to the next step, which is talking about this select box tool. This works the same way as the select box in object mode, and pretty much you can just left click and hold to drag, and it will select everything within your box. Notice how everything at the back here is still unselected. If we want to select everything through our object as well, we can come up to the top here and left click this X-ray button. Notice how my object will become transparent, and now when I left click and drag over my cylinder, you can see it will select everything, even the things through the object. I'll turn off my X-ray just now, and to deselect stuff I can just left click away from my object, and that will deselect all my faces. I'll left click and hold this, and you can see we've got a few different more tools here, such as select circle, which allows you to select things, and we have lasso select, which allows you to left click and hold draw to select things. I'm not going too in depth into these because I did cover it in a previous tutorial, so if you want to learn more about these tools here and also these buttons up here, I highly recommend checking out that video if you haven't already. The hotkey for quickly accessing the circle selection tool with C is still functional in edit mode as well, and it works just the same as in object mode. So now I've pressed C, I can left click to select things, and once I'm satisfied with my selection, I can just right click to get rid of it. This is much easier than having to switch in and out of it from this menu here. Now if I want to select everything in edit mode, all I need to do is press A. I like to think of it as A for all, and I mentioned before we can select away from our object to deselect everything, but there's a handy hotkey as well, and to really make sure you've deselected everything, you can hold down Alt and then A. So just think of it as resetting the selection to nothing. So Alt A for deselect all. Something else to know about object mode and edit mode is you can actually add additional objects inside of edit mode, although these won't be a separate object but rather additional mesh inside our cylinder here. So I could press Shift A for example, and I could left click cube for example, and press G and X since all my faces are selected. Do keep in mind if they're not selected then it won't move, and I'll left click it to save it there. You can see if I press tab to go into object mode, I can't select these objects individually because this cube was created inside of edit mode of this cylinder. So technically this cube is part of the cylinder. I'll press tab to go back into edit mode for now. I can still press A to select everything, but if I want to just select my cylinder, then I would need to use a different form of selection. So either I could select everything manually, or I could hover my mouse over my desired object and just press L. I like to think of it as L for linked selection. And this will select everything which is connected together in the mesh. So since these two objects aren't connected together, it won't be selected. You can press L again and you can see it's just going to continue to select things. You can also remove a linked selection by pressing Shift L, and you can see that's going to deselect that object. To further demonstrate how this linked works, I'm going to quickly do something which I don't want you to follow along with. I'm just going to left click this face here and then shift select one of these faces here. Then I'm going to press Ctrl E and choose bridge edge loops. Don't worry about what any of this is doing just now, but all I want you to know is that pretty much I've connected these two objects together, and so they're now united. If I now press L, you will see it will select everything, and that's because this cube and this cylinder has now been connected with a bridge here. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo those changes for now. As I mentioned earlier, we can select more faces by left clicking, and then we can shift left click other faces we want to select. But this isn't the only way of selecting multiple. We can also use Control left click, which will allow us to select things in a path. To explain this, I'll first left click one of these faces here, and if I hold down Control and select this face here, you can see it selected the faces in between as well. How this works is it selects the shortest path to the last face I've selected. So I've got this face here. If I hold down Control and left click this face here, it's going to fill in the gaps and select all of those faces from. Also, if I hold down Control and then left click this face here, you notice it's not going to wrap all the way around like you might expect, and that's because the shortest path from this face to this face is around this way, and the shortest path isn't going to choose this way because, as you can see, it's much longer. As you know, we can add loop cuts in Blender by holding down Control R and left clicking, and usually while you're modeling you're going to end up finding yourself having some more loops. Another thing I didn't show you in the last tutorial is when you press Control R, you can scroll the wheel on your mouse to increase the number of loop cuts you want to create. So I'm just going to left click it there and then right click to keep it in the center. You can also open up this loop cut and slide menu, and you can see the number of cuts can be altered here by adjusting this parameter. If you want to select one of these loops, rather than left clicking and then Control left clicking or Shift left clicking, an easier way to do this is to hold down the Alt key and then left click. And you can see that has selected that entire edge loop. This has worked because I am in edge select mode, which you can see up at the top here. If you were still in face select mode, it would just select an entire loop of faces instead. With vertex mode, it will select a loop of edges, just like in edge select mode. Of course, if you want to select more loops, you can hold down Shift and then Alt left click on another loop to select that one as well. I'm going to come over to my cube here and I'm going to add some loop cuts to it as well. So hold down Control R and I'm going to bring my mouse over my cube here and I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel just to add some more loops. I added 6 there, and I'm going to do the same in the other direction too. I'll press Control R, hover my mouse over this way, scroll my mouse wheel, and then left click. And now you can see I've got a bunch of squares on the top of my object. Something you'll notice is if we want to select all of these faces on top, we can use a command called Shift Control left. So I'll hold down Shift and then Control, and with those two keys held, I can just left click this opposite corner here, and you can see it will select that entirety of these faces. So this is a handy tool to select a lot of faces on a surface like this. I'm going to press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode, and this is going to show you how we can select, rather than a loop with alt left click, we can select a ring of edges going in the other direction by holding down Control Alt and then pressing left click. You can see I can select all the edges going around like this. I also found when I hold down the Alt GR key on my computer and left click here, it will automatically do the Control Alt left click for you. I'm not quite sure why that is, but that's a handy tool you can have if your keyboard has an Alt GR key. I'm just going to press 3 on the keyboard to go into face select mode, and I'm going to select this top face here. And if I press Control I, you can see that everything else will be selected. This tool is called invert selection, so you can think of it as Control I for invert. Like a lot of these selection tools, you can come up to this option at the top here called select, and here you can find all of your options, and some of them even display the hotkey, which is really handy if you forget. You can see, for example, there's the select all here, select none, and the invert, which we were just covering. So if you ever get lost, you can always come to this menu as well. If I turn on my X-ray again, up here, you can also toggle it with Alt-Z. I can left click and drag to box select all these faces here. And if I want to select the mirror of this, I can press Shift Control M, and you can see that that's now going to mirror my selection on the X-axis. If you want to change the axis, there's a box here that will appear called select mirror, and here I can choose in which way I want to select my mirror. So you can see if I put it to Y, nothing will change because we already have the mirrored Y axis faces selected. Z would do the up and down. So I highly recommend playing around with this selection tool yourself to get more familiar with it. Another thing you can do as well is extend your selection by left clicking this box, and what that'll do is it'll keep your old selection and add the new selection to it. If you forget the hotkey, you can come up to the select menu and you can find select mirror here. I'll press Alt Z to turn off the X-ray. Next up, we have select random. So if I'll come to my select option here, and then here I can left click select random, you can see it's going to select a bunch of faces at random. This can be great if you want to maybe apply a material to a bunch of random faces, or if you wanted to create a random vertex group. If you have no idea what those things are, don't worry about it. We'll maybe talk about it in a later tutorial. Also, if I press 3 on the keyboard to make sure I'm in face select mode and press Alt left click on this set of faces here to select that loop, we can also come to select and choose check or deselect. You'll notice this will now deselect every face in between. And here a little box called check or deselect will appear, and I can left click to open it, and here I can make some adjustments to how this works. So for example, I can make it so for every 2 selected ones there's 1 unselected, and so on. I'm going to press Alt left click to select this face loop here. I'm going to press Alt A to deselect everything, and then I'm going to press Alt left click to select this loop here. If I want to select more or less, I can hold down Control and then press the plus key on your numpad if you have one. I don't have a numpad, so unfortunately I can't show you this hotkey, but if you still want to do it, you can come up to select, then under more or less, you can select more. And you'll notice that this is going to select the next 2 loops up. We also have the option to come to more or less and then choose select less, and now that's going to reduce our selection by those loops. I'm going to press Alt A to deselect everything, and finally the last form of selection we're going to cover today is the sharp edges selection. So I'll left click this select up here, and then I'm going to choose sharp edges. Since I'm in face select mode, you can notice it's going to select a lot more than necessary. So I can change to edge select mode by pressing 2 on the keyboard, press Alt A to deselect everything, and then press select and then choose sharp edges again. And now things are going to be working a lot more intuitively. Usually I find a sharpness of 30 or 60 will usually select most of the edges you're wanting to select. Keep in mind, if I go 90 or higher, it's not going to select anything else, and that's because it's calculating it based on the angle between each face, and the angle here between this sharp edge is about 90 degrees. So when we hit 90 degrees, it's going to stop considering that a sharp edge for that operation. And yeah, that just about covers the most used selection options you have in Blender when modeling. Unfortunately, when modeling, encountering some shading issues and things like that is a common occurrence. So today I'm going to be teaching you the most important thing to prevent these shading issues from happening, and that's understanding normals. So first of all, I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh, I'm going to add a cube. Then I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode. Right now, you can see we've got a nice cube, and a normal is essentially the direction that each of these faces have. Vertices can also have a norm, which can be important to fix sometimes, but for today, we're just going to focus on the normals of the faces. Right now though, we can't see the direction of our faces normals, so we need to enable that. To do that, I'm going to come up to this symbol, which looks like 2 circles, called Show Overlays. Then there's an arrow beside it, and when I left click it, you can see there's more things here which I can enable to display. You can see this menu allows you to remove things, such as these axes for example, or the floor. I'm going to turn them back on by left clicking them. But here we're looking for this thing called Face Orientation. Right now you can see everything has been turned blue. This blueness is not caused by a material, but rather it's showing us what way our faces are facing. So right now, the blue means that these faces are facing outside, which is correct and what we're looking for. If your faces are facing the wrong way, they will be red. To demonstrate this, I'm going to zoom in to my object until eventually I go inside it. Now I'm inside the object. You can see the faces inside are red, as they should be, since this is the inside of the face, and the inside of the face should be red. But why is this important? Well, if all these faces were red, it would be likely to cause some shading issues inside a Blender. But the problem stretches even outside a Blender. For example, when you take it into some game engines display the inside of a face as transparent. So you might end up with a completely invisible object if all your faces were inside out. But as long as your faces are blue like this, you should be all good to go in terms of normals. But that begs the question, how do these normals even get messed up in the first place? Sometimes it can happen while you're editing your object. It's kind of hard to demonstrate because it's sometimes hard to know what exactly causes it, but pretty much the only way you'll be able to know is if your face is turned red. So what I've done is, just for the sake of example, I've quickly changed the normal of one of these faces off camera just to show you how we can fix it. Since we only have one face here that's affected, it's actually very easy. All I need to do is left click this face here, then I can left click this mesh option, and here we have a normals menu. And here you can see we've got a few options, some of them with some hotkeys. So I can choose this flip button, and that's just going to alter it. But there's actually a much easier way we can do this using the hotkeys. I've messed up a couple more faces again, and this time we just want to recalculate everything so it's facing outside. And to do that, we can just recalculate the normals as a whole. So if you remember, we can press A to select all, and then what I'm going to do is press Shift N, and that's going to recalculate the normals, which means the ones that are outside will be made outside. And this can be great if you have an object with a lot of faces and you need to make sure that all of your faces are facing outside. You can see a little menu will appear, and I can left click to open this, and if for whatever reason you wanted to make it inside out, you could just left click this inside button, and now everything which is calculated as outside will now be inside in terms of face normal orientation. Something else you can do, rather than going and trying to find the flip command, you can press Ctrl Shift N to flip it in the inside automatically without having to check the box. But this is quite a rare case. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that, and last thing I'm going to show you is another way we can show our normals, and this is only accessible in edit mode. So I'll come up here and make sure that I'm in edit mode. And here, there's a button here called Mesh Edit Mode. And if I left click it, you can see I've got a few more options. And here, under normals, you can see we can show some different types of normals. For example, the vertex normals, which I'll talk about in a later video. And we've also got face normals, which will allow us to see the direction of our faces. You can see that these lines are pointing outward, showcasing how they're facing the right way. You can notice if I choose A and then Ctrl Shift N and reset everything, you can see we can't see the lines anymore because they're now pointing inside. So these blue lines are another way to tell if your normals are facing the right way. If you want to make them bigger, you can change the size of them here in this menu. When I press tab to go back into object mode, you can see that we can no longer see those lines. So it is an edit mode only feature. But yeah, that just about covers the basics of normals in Blender and why they're important to know about when you're modeling. Today, we're going to be talking about the transform pivot point in Blender. I'll press Shift A, and then under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cylinder. We've talked a little bit about pivot points already in the origin point video tutorial, and to edit it, you can just come up to this little button here called Transform Pivot Point. The first one we'll talk about is Medium Point, which is the default. This will make it so when we have our one object here and press R, you can see it's going to rotate around our origin point. If I press Shift A, and then under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cube, and I'm going to press G and Y and move this cube along. Then, if I then shift left click my cylinder, and now I press R to rotate, you can see rather than rotating from the origin, it's going to rotate in the middle of these two objects, which is why it is known as medium point and not origin point per se. However, if you wanted to rotate the object of these two objects using both of their individual origin points, we can switch it to individual origins. And now when I press R to rotate, you can see it's going to rotate it based on each object's own origin point. Next up, we have 3D cursor. This will make it so the 3D cursor, which is this red and white striped circle cursor in the center here, is now the reference point for our transforms. So now when I press R, you can see it's going to rotate around that 3D cursor. I'm going to press S to scale. It's also going to scale based on that 3D cursor as a reference point. This can be handy because obviously I could press Shift right click like we covered in the 3D cursor video to move my cursor, and now when I press R, you can see it's now going to rotate off that 3D cursor. If you want to learn more about moving the 3D cursor in different ways and how it can be useful, I highly recommend checking out that video. We also have this option called Active Element. Briefly, in a previous tutorial in the series, I mentioned about active objects and non-active selected objects. The active selected object will be the one which has the brightest highlight around it. In my case, is this white outline, but for some of you, it might be a bright yellow outline. The not active selected object will have an orange outline. There's limitations to what you can and can't do with active and non-active selected objects, but the active selected object will determine a few things, and one of those things is the active element option here in transform pivot point. What this means is the active object's origin point will become the pivot point for our transforms. So when I press S, for example, it's going to scale using the origin of our active selected object, which is our cylinder in this case, and when we rotate, is going to rotate off that origin point as well. To change our active selected object, I can shift left click the cube again, and that's not going to deselect it, but rather is going to change it to the active selected object. And now when I press R, you can see that now the cube is now the reference point for rotation and scale. If I was to shift left click active object, you can see it will deselect. I'll shift left click again to make it active. Finally, the last one we have is bounding box center. When I press S, you can see it's going to scale it from the center. When I rotate it, it's also going to rotate it from the center. And no matter what my active object is, that will always be true. And yeah, that just about covers the transform pivot points. Hey everyone, today we're going to be learning about the magnet tool in Blender and how we can use it. First of all, we're going to need some objects to play around with. So I'm going to press Shift A to open the add menu, and then under mesh, I'm just going to choose cube. I'm then going to use my duplicate command, which if you remember is Shift and then D. And that'll allow me to duplicate an object. Then I can press G and then X. And that's going to allow me to grab my object and then move it along the X-axis. Then I'll just left click to finish positioning it. I'm going to left click my first object, and I'm going to come up to this here, and you can see there's a little magnet button. You can left click to turn it on or off, or you can also use the hotkey Shift and then Tab. Notice how that will turn it on and off as well. Beside the magnet, there's a menu called snapping, and this is just all the settings for the magnet. You can see there's a collection of different snap targets, and there's also a snap base, which determines how it snaps to said snap target. These ones here are very important for retopology in Blender, but this is out of the scope of today's tutorial, so I'll cover it at a later date. Increment will just mean when we move our object, it's just going to snap it to the Blender grid incrementally. So when I press G and then Y, you'll notice how it is now snapping towards each square on the grid. This of course works in edit mode too, so if I press tab to go into edit mode, and I'll press 1 on the keyboard to vertex select mode, and I'll left click a vertex, and when I press G and Y, you can notice it's going to snap it in increments to that grid as well. Keep in mind though, if I press tab to go into edit mode, press A to select everything, press shift tab to turn off the magnet, and then press G to move my object in some way. When I press tab to go back into object mode, and press shift tab to turn the magnet back on, and then press G and then X for example, you'll notice how it's going to snap to the grid incrementally relative to the origin. If I wanted to fix this, I could right click, then choose set origin, and then origin to geometry, as we learned in the previous tutorial. Now when I press G and X, and then all we would need to do is press Alt G to return our object to the center of the world, since our location hasn't been applied. And now when I press G and X, it'll be back to normal. If you're confused about the origin point, one of the previous tutorials in this series is a dedicated video on that topic. The next one I want to talk about is vertex. And when I have this selected and then I press G and X, you'll notice that no immediate snapping will be seen. But if I move my mouse over to one of the vertices on this other cube here, you can see it's going to snap to that vertex. But one thing you're noticing though is that it's snapping at the center. And if you remember, when I opened this magnet menu, the snap base was set to center. So if we wanted to do it the other way, we could change it to closest. And now when I press G and X, you can see it's going to snap like that, which may be a lot more useful for you. I definitely find myself using this option a lot more than the center option. When you're happy with your magnet placement, you can just left click to save it. Of course, this isn't limited to vertices, you can also do it with edges as well. So I could press G and X, and this way I could snap to any edges I want. Things get a lot more interesting though when we go into edit mode. So I press tab to go into edit mode now, and I'm still in vertex select mode, which is 1 on the keyboard. I'm going to left click one of my vertices, and now I can press G to move it, and you can see how I could just snap it to any of these edges here. And I can also set it to face, for example. And now if I press 3 on the keyboard and left click a face and press G, you can see I can line it up with one of these faces here. There's also an option called Edge Center, and when I choose this and press G, you can see it's going to line it up specifically with just the center of the edges, which can be quite handy sometimes. And the last one I want to cover here is the snap base by setting it to active. I'm just going to use the vertex snap target for this example, but essentially what the active will do is it will snap based on the active selection. Remember how we talked about active and not active objects, which are selected? Well, the same thing can happen in edit mode with our selections too. So for example, if I shift left click this vertex and then shift left click it again, this vertex will now be the active vertex because it was the last one selected. That means when I press G, you'll notice that wherever I snap to a vertex, that vertex will be the one which it snaps to. And you can test this because if I was to shift left click this vertex here and then shift left click it again, now you'll notice that this vertex here will be the active one. When I press G and snap it, you can see it's now snapping using that one. So active can be a really handy tool to use as well. But yeah, that just about covers the basics of using the magnet tool in Blender. You can see how this could be really useful when you're modeling. For example, I could left click this vertex here, I'll set it back to closest and then choose G and X. You can see I could easily overlap a vertex I want to overlap, and also if I've moved something out of place, I could press G and then X again and I could line it up with this vertex here. And because I've locked it to that one axis, you'll notice how it's not going to move down and line up directly with it. So that means you can line things up on just one axis, which is really handy. So yeah, we're going to be using this tool a lot in the upcoming tutorials in the series once we get some modeling practice in. Hey everyone, today I'm going to be showing you one of the common tools you will use in Blender while you're modeling, and that's the Bevel tool. To get started, I'm going to add a cube. So I'll press Shift A to open the add menu, then under Mesh I'm going to choose Cube. Then to start modeling, I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode. Then I'm going to press 3 on the keyboard, and I'm just going to left click this top face here, and then I'm going to press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select. You can notice that down here there's an option here called Bevel on the toolbar, and if I left click this, you can see a yellow circle will appear, and I can just left click and hold it to start beveling. Something else you'll notice as well is there's a little box at the bottom here called Bevel, and if I left click to open it, you can see I can adjust more of the settings here. Do keep in mind though, if you click away, this menu will disappear. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. You'll also notice here that we can set the segments of the bevel. So for example, I could set it to 3 for example. And now when I left click and drag, you can see it's created 3 bevels. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. We also have a shape here. And if I change this parameter and then left click and drag, you can see how it's going to start altering the shape. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. You'll also notice there's an option here called Offset, and this will determine the way in which the bevel is calculated. But to be honest, this isn't the way I usually bevel things, as I don't tend to use this toolbar much in edit mode. I'm going to come back to my select box and left click it because that's the default. And instead of using that bevel tool, we can simply just press Ctrl and then B, and that's just going to do the same operation. You'll notice it will save all the settings that we've had from that bevel tool, but I can easily reset them. For example, I could set my shape, which I altered, back to 0.5, and I could set my segments here back to 1, so they're now the default. I'm going to rotate around to the bottom of my object here, and if I press 2 on the keyboard and then left click this edge here, what you'll notice is you can bevel even just a singular edge, and you can also scroll your mouse wheel to increase the segments as you bevel. Another cool thing you can do, if I press 1 to go into vertex select mode and left click one of these vertices here and then press Ctrl and then B and then left click, nothing will happen yet, but if I open my bevel menu and change it to effect from edges to vertices, you'll notice I can now bevel a single vertex as well. If I press Ctrl Z to undo that, I can also shift left click another vertex here, and when I press Ctrl B, by default it's going to bevel it like normal, but I can change it in this menu here to affect vertices, and now you'll notice I can get it to bevel just a vertex at a time instead. I'll press Tab to come back into object mode, and I'm just going to press G and X to move my object along. Something to keep in mind with using the bevel tool is sometimes it's actually more optimal to use the bevel modifier instead. This is because the bevel modifier is non-destructive, meaning it can be edited or removed at any time. I don't currently have a video on the bevel modifier, but there is one planned for the near future. Although if you're watching this video in the future, you may get a card for that video in the top right hand corner of this video just now. But if not, and you want to see that video in the future, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll be notified when that video comes out. Apart from that though, we're going to continue on with this bevel tool. So I'll press Shift A, and this time, under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cylinder. I'll press Tab to go into edit mode, press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode, and I'm going to press Alt left click to select this top loop. I'm going to press Ctrl B again to create a nice bevel, and this time I'm going to come down to this option called Profile Type. I'm going to go more into depth with this during the bevel modifier video, but this is a really cool way to customize how our bevel looks. Notice here by default it's just using a plain straight line like this, and you can see how that is being represented in the 3D viewport. But I can left click to add another point, and when I move this, you can see it's going to affect the curve of our bevel. I can left click and edit these as well, and you can see how I can create loads of interesting shapes just using this bevel. However, that isn't all. We can also use these presets. For example, I could set the preset to steps, as I demonstrated in another video. We also have a crown molding, which we don't really have enough geometry for, so what I will do is come to the top and I'm just going to increase my segments, and you can notice how we get a really cool effect now. This could be awesome for creating a column. We also have a cornice molding as well, so you can see there's already quite a few cool presets built into Blender to help us create some cool bevels. If you want to turn it back, you can change back to super ellipse, which is the default. I'll press Tab to come back into object mode. And one last thing I want to show you is the importance of applying the scale when using the bevel. If I press S and then Z to scale this object, and then I'm going to come to the bottom of my object here, press Tab to go into edit mode, 2, to go into edge select mode, and then Alt left click to select this bottom loop here. When I press Ctrl B, you'll notice that our bevel is very skewed, and if we want to prevent this from happening, we'll need to apply the scale first. So I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that, tab to come back into object mode, and then I'm going to press Ctrl and then A. That's going to open a menu called the Apply menu. Then I can just choose Scale, press Tab to come back into Edit mode, and now when I press Ctrl B, you'll notice it's going to bevel like normal. So something you'll find a lot in Blender is a lot of these problems are actually caused by not applying the scale. I actually made a full video dedicated to explaining why applying the scale is so important, and a few cases where you really need to do it. So I highly recommend checking that out if you're brand new to the concept of applying the scale and want to prevent issues like this from happening in the future. Apart from that though, that pretty much covers the basics of using the bevel tool in Blender. Hey everyone, today I'm going to be showing you a cool tool you can use when modeling in Blender called the knife tool. So first of all, I'm going to need to add an object. So I'm going to press Shift A, then under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cylinder. Then I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit mode. And let's say I want to create a big cut through this object. To do that, it would be really simple. All I need to do is press K, and you can see a little knife symbol appears. Then I'll just need to choose a point where I want to start, so I can choose anywhere. I can either snap it to a vertex, or I can just choose a random point on an edge. I'm going to start with a vertex, left click, and then you can see I can pull out this here, and it will snap if you want it to an edge or a vertex. So maybe I'll left click here, and then you can just keep left clicking until you're satisfied with how your cut looks. Now, part that some people struggle with is knowing what to do once you've actually made all the cuts with a knife tool. It's actually very simple. All you need to do is press the Enter key on your computer, and you can see our cut has now been saved. If you want to get rid of some of these edges as well, for example, if you didn't like how it turned out, then I could left click this edge here, shift left click this edge here, and then just press Control X. Control X will not delete the edges, but rather it will dissolve them, meaning it won't destroy too much of the geometry. I'll press 1 to go into vertex select mode, and maybe I'll press Alt left click to select this bottom face here, and then I'll press I to inset. And now probably what I could do is edit this to kind of create a bit of a wedge shape. So maybe I could use my knife tool again, left click here, then left click here. You could also use the join tool if you know how to use that. And then once I'm happy, I can just press enter. Then I can left click this vertex here, and press G and Y for example to just move it along the Y axis. And if I press tab to come back to object mode, you can see I've got a bit of a cutout in my cylinder now. You notice though how I've done this inset first, and that's very important just to make sure we don't have any weird shading issues with a massive engon. I am going to be talking about quads, tris and engons in the future, which are the three types of faces you get in 3D and Blender. Another thing you'll notice as well is you can also access the knife tool in the toolbar here in edit mode. So I can left click here and hold, and you can see I can use the knife tool this way as well. But yeah, that pretty much covers the basics of using the knife tool in Blender. Today I'm going to be going over all the extrude options you have in Blender while you're modeling. We covered the basics of extruding, so let's have a quick recap. So I'll press Shift A, and under Mesh I'm going to choose Cube to add the cube into my scene, and then I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit mode. To go into Face Select mode, I'm going to press 3 on the keyboard, and that means when I left click I can select one of my faces. Last time we learned that if we press E on the keyboard, we can extrude a face or a vertex or an edge out like this. It also works with a collection of faces, vertices or edges as well. When you're happy with your extrusion, you can just press left click to save it. If I come to my edit mode toolbar here, you can see here we have an option called extrude region. If I left click this, you can see a little gizmo will appear, and when I hold down the plus with left click and pull, you can see it's going to work just like the E key on the keyboard. As I mentioned in previous tutorials, I usually like to use shortcuts or hotkeys instead of the toolbar, as it's a lot faster and more intuitive for me. If I hold down this extrude region box, you can see we have a bunch of options which we're going to be covering today. You can also access these with a hotkey. If I left click the select box, go back to default, I can press Alt E, and that's going to open the extrude menu. And here you can see we've got all of those options we had. For now, I'm going to press Ctrl Z until I have just my default cube again, and then I'm going to press A, and I'm then going to right click and choose Subdivide. I'm going to be going over the Subdivide tool more in depth in the next video, but for now I'm just going to open up this Subdivide box and increase my number of cuts to something like 2. Then I'm going to left click one of my faces here, and I'm going to press Alt E, and this time I'm going to choose Extrude Manifold. You can see when I pull out a face here that it hasn't left behind some edges like you would usually get when extruding. Also, if I pull it back, you can see that it's not going to go inward like with a normal extrusion. I'm going to compare the two just now. So I'll left click to save it here, and then I'm going to choose the face on this side here, and just press E, which is a normal extrusion. Notice how when I bring it out, there's still edges here, and when I pull it inward, you can see that it's going to preserve the faces here as well. So extrude manifold is great to avoid this kind of issue here. You notice if I press 1 to go into vertex select mode, that's also created some more vertices here for us. And if I press 3 on the keyboard, select this face, and then press 1 on the keyboard to go into vertex select, press Alt E and then choose extrude manifold again. When I pull out my manifold, you can see that it's going to create what we call an n-gon, which is a face with over 4 vertices. I'm going to be talking about the 3 types of faces, tris, n-gons and quads, in a later video in this series, as it's quite an important topic. I'm going to press Ctrl Z and just undo all of my changes. This time I'm going to left click this face here, and I'm going to shift left click a few random faces which I want to extrude at the same time. Now I'm going to press Alt E, and this time I'm going to choose extrude faces along normals. When I left click this, you can see when I move my mouse, I can extrude multiple faces at the same time. And while it's working fine for these extrusions here, you can see the ones which share a vertex have some issues. To better demonstrate what's happening, I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo, then I'm going to press A to select everything. Now when I press Alt E and choose extrude faces along normals, you can see that it's going to keep everything connected together like this. This may be fine for some purposes, but if you just want to extrude all of your faces out at once, like I've shown on the thumbnail here, this might not be what you're looking for. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo, and instead what we can do is press Alt E and choose extrude individual faces. Now you'll notice it's going to bring out all the faces and there won't be any connections. There is a bit of a caveat to this though, and that's that if I left click one of my faces here and press G to move it, you can see that this face isn't attached to the faces beside it. However, fixing this is super easy. All I would need to do is just press A to select everything, and if you remember in a previous tutorial, we can use the merge tool. So I'll press M on the keyboard to open the merge menu, and we can just choose by distance. If I open up this merge by distance menu, you can see it's going to choose a really small number. Keep it at this because this small number will pretty much make it so only the vertices that are overlapping each other will be merged together. And that'll prevent us from merging anything together that we don't want to merge. Now when I left click one of my faces and press G, you can see it's now connected. I'll right click to cancel my movement, and now I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo all my changes again. The next tool I want to cover is the extrude to cursor tool. So I'll left click a face, and this isn't going to extrude to our 3D cursor, but rather it refers to the mouse cursor. So to do this is really simple. All you do is hold down Ctrl and then right click, and you can see it's going to pull out my face like that, and I can just keep doing it, and I can create some easy extrusions that way. Also, if I left click this face here and come down to my extrude region tool on the toolbar, left click and hold and change to extrude to cursor. Now all I need to do is just left click with this tool, and you can see it's going to create some very easy extrusions. Press Ctrl Z to undo all of those changes. I can also press 1 on the keyboard, go into vertex select mode, and I'm going to left click my select box again and left click one of my vertices, and I can of course press Ctrl right click with this as well to make some extrusions that way, and you can do this with edges too. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo all of that. I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard to make sure I'm in vertex select mode still, and when I press Alt E, you're going to notice that we have a couple more options, that being extrude edges and extrude vertices. Extrude edges, if I left click it and then I'll press S to scale, you can see that it's extruded out just the edges and it's ignored the faces. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo those changes, and I'll press A again, and this time when I press Alt E, I'm going to choose extrude vertices. Now when I press S, you can see it's just going to pull out some vertices. So that's a cool way to get a little bit more control over your extrusions. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. This time I'm going to press Alt E, and I'm going to choose extrude repeat. Right now, if I open up this extrude repeat menu in the bottom left hand corner here, you can see we've got a few options, and it's actually created a bunch of extrusions in a direction. If you've ever used the array modifier before, extrude repeat works in a very similar manner. To start off, you can see we've got something called an offset, and this determines what direction the extrude repeat will go in. So I'm going to left click and then quickly drag down. You can see that's going to highlight all of my offset axes here. I'm just going to type in the number 0. That's just going to keep it at the default, and I just want to move it across this green line here, so the only one we need to worry about is the y-axis. So I'll left click the arrow here, and you can see it's going to push it inward, and that means we just need to do it the other way. So I'll left click the other arrow instead and start moving it out. You can see we've got a bunch of extrusions being pulled out, and the number of extrusions we have is determined by the steps here. So I could change it to a lower number, and then I can decrease my y-axis in this case, and you can see that way we can create a bunch of extrusions in a row. You can also further adjust our offset by using the scale offset parameter. And when I increase this, you can see it's just going to increase everything. And yeah, that just about covers all the tools you need to know for extruding in Blender. Today, we're going to be learning about the Subdivide tool while modeling in Blender. So to get started, I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cube. Then I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode, and I'll press A to select everything. Then I can right click and I can choose Subdivide. And you're going to see in the bottom left hand corner, a little menu will appear, which is called Subdivide. You can just left click it to open it. You may also know about something called the Subdivision Surface Modifier in Blender. This works very similarly, but it is slightly different, and I actually made a video going in depth into this modifier and comparing it with the Subdivide tool. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend checking out that video after you watch this one. For us though, let's continue going in depth for this tool. First thing you'll notice is number of cuts. This determines how many times it's going to subdivide things. So you notice when I increase it, the number of cuts will also increase. I'm going to increase it to 5 for now. Then we have something called smoothness. You'll notice as I increase this value that our cube is going to become more bloated until it becomes a sphere shape. This can be great if you want to make a quad sphere in Blender, or if you just want to make a more bloated looking cube like this. For now, I'm going to set the smoothness parameter to 0. Next up, we have a parameter called fractal. When I increase this number, you can notice that it's going to start displacing our vertices randomly. This can be cool for creating some variation or some displacement without having to use any displacement modifiers or textures. The along normal parameter will only go up to the number 1, and it pretty much is applying the fractal along the normals of these faces. If you don't know what normal is, I did make a video on it as a previous installment in this Blender Modeling for Absolute Beginners series. So I highly recommend checking that one out if you're interested. Next up we have the random seed. This is for the fractal, and all it does is just create some more variation. So you can see I can get a slightly altered version of my cube each time I change the seed. I'm going to press tab to come back into object mode, and I'm going to press Shift A again. Then under mesh I'm going to choose cylinder. Then I'm going to press G and Y and pull this along, and we're going to talk about subdivision with this cylinder. So I'll press tab to go into edit mode, and then I'm going to press A to select everything, and then I'm going to right click and choose subdivide. First thing you'll notice is looking a little bit noisy, and that's because it's using our fractal settings which we set for the cube still. You'll also notice that it's not going to subdivide this top face here because it's an n-gon and a little bit too hard to subdivide for Blender. But that works okay for us. In the bottom left hand corner you can see there's a subdivide menu, so I'm going to open it up again, and here I'm just going to set my fractal back down to 0. But even though our fractal isn't in play, you can still see we have a bit of an issue, and it'll become more apparent the more I subdivide. You can see how the new subdivisions are not responding to the circular shape of the cylinder. You might think to use the smoothness, however you will see that it's going to become bloated as well. I'll turn it back down to 0. Another thing that you might think of doing is if I come to my toolbar here and come down, you can see there's a smooth tool, and when I left click this and then left click and hold, you can see there's a smooth vertices panel that's appeared, and if I open it and change my smoothing up to a positive number like 1, you can see that's kind of smoothed it out and it's looking a little bit better, but it's also shrunk our cylinder a bit. One way to fix this would be to turn off the Z axis, but if you zoom in here you can notice that it doesn't seem quite to be perfectly cylindrical. So there is an alternative method too. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo those changes, and thankfully there's a very easy way that we can fix our circles here to make them more circular again, and that's we can use a special built-in add-on in Blender. By built-in I mean you don't need to download anything from the internet per se, as it's already accessible in Blender. However, in Blender 4.2 it actually does use the internet now, and you do have to install it. So I'm going to cover the change in 4.2 and 4.1 and before. So to start, I'm going to left click edit, and then I'm going to choose preferences. Then if you're in Blender 4.1 or earlier, you can just left click add-ons, and you can search for loop tools in here and just enable it by checking the box. However, if you're in Blender 4.2, you will need to install it from the internet first. Here you can use the search bar and you can just search for loop tools. Here it will appear, and if I open it up, there'll be a button like this one here where you can just install. It will also list the website for the add-on. Then if you go to add-ons, you can search for it in here and left click the box to check it if it isn't already enabled. Once you're done, you can left click these 3 bars in the bottom left hand corner and then choose Save Preferences for good measure. Then I'll press X on my Blender Preferences menu to close it. Now to use the Loop Tools add-on, all we're going to do is press 2 on the keyboard to go into Edge Select mode, and if you remember, to select a loop we can just press Alt left click, and that's going to select one loop, and then I can hold down Shift Alt left click to select these loops as well. Then I can right click, and then under Loop Tools I can choose Circle, and now you can see it's made things cylindrical again. Another thing with the subdivision is, for example, maybe I only wanted to have subdivisions going up and down, as these loops in between may just end up being unnecessary geometry which will add to our render times. So there's an easy way to get rid of them. I can just press Alt left click on the ones I want to get rid of, and then Shift Alt left click on the other one, and then I can just press Control X. And unlike X, which deletes things, Control X will dissolve what you have selected. And yeah, that pretty much covers the basics of how to get started with the subdivision tool inside of Blender. Hey everyone, today we're going to be learning about how we can connect two opposing faces or sets of faces, like shown in the thumbnail here. This is a handy modeling tool which you'll end up using a lot in your Blender workflow. To start off, I'm going to create some cubes so we can actually make some connections. So I'll press Shift A, and then under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cube. Then I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit mode, A to select everything, right click, and then I'm going to choose Subdivide. Then you can see a menu called Subdivide will appear here, and I can left click it to open it. Do keep in mind if you click away, this menu will also disappear, but here I can set my number of cuts, so I'm going to change it to a number like 5. Great, now I'm just going to press A, and then I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate this cube in edit mode, and then I'm going to press G and X with it selected to grab it and then move it along this X axis. I'll zoom in, and now I'm going to want to connect one of these faces. So to start simple, I'm going to press 3 on the keyboard, and then I'm going to left click one of my faces here, and I'm just going to choose an opposing face. I could choose any of these faces here, but I'm just going to choose the one which is directly opposed to it, which is this one here. So I'll shift left click it, and now if I want to connect these two, we can use a command called the bridge edge loops. So to access this, I just need to hold down the control key and then press E, and here you can see we've got some edge options, and the one we're looking for here is bridge edge loops. And now you can see it's connected it nicely. If I wanted to, I could select a few opposing faces. So maybe I could press Control Shift left click here to select that square, and then I could select one on the other side. Maybe this time I'll make a bit of a diagonal shape. So I'll left click this square here and then Shift Control left click this one here, and then I can press Control E to open the edge menu again and then choose bridge edge loops, and you can see it's going to connect those two together like that. I press Control Z to undo those changes. Something you can't do, unfortunately, is if I select a face here and then shift left click a face here, and then I shift select those opposing faces. So maybe I'll shift left click this one here and this one here, press Control E and then choose bridge edge loops. You can see it's not going to quite work that way, unfortunately. I'll press Control Z to undo that. And last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a big connection in the middle here, like I've shown in the thumbnail. So I'm going to left click this face here, shift control, left click this face here to select all those faces at once. Then I'm going to go for the opposing faces. So I'll shift left click this face here and then shift control, left click this face here. And then finally, I can open the edge menu by pressing control and then E and then choose bridge edge loops. And yeah, a really simple tool, but one you'll probably find yourself using a lot in Blender, called the bridge edge loops. One last thing to note is that if I zoom into my object here and go inside, you can notice that the bridge edge loops remove those other faces, which helps keep our topology optimized. Hey everyone, today we're going to be learning about the proportional editing tool inside of Blender, which will help us when we're editing our objects while modeling. To get started, I'm going to add a cube so we can showcase this tool. So I'll press Shift and then A to open the add menu. Then under mesh, I'm going to choose cube. Then I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode and press A to select everything. Then I'm going to right click and then left click subdivide. You can see this has created some more faces on my cube for us to edit, and a little menu called subdivide will appear in the bottom left hand corner, which I can just left click to open, and here I can increase my number of cuts. I'm just going to go for something like 8, and you can see that's added a lot more faces. To turn on the proportional editing tool, we can come to the top here, and right beside this little curve symbol, you can see there's a little circle within a circle. This is the proportional editing tool, and you just left click it to turn it on, and you can see it will go blue when it's enabled. You can also press the O key on the computer to toggle it on and off. If I left click this curve button beside it, this is all the settings for the proportional editing. You can see here we have something called proportional size, which I'm going to demonstrate in a minute. I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard, which is going to take us into vertex select, and I'm going to scroll in and left click one of my vertices. Right now you can see we have our proportional editing enabled because it's blue, and I'm just going to press G and then Z to pull up this vertex on the Z axis, and you can notice how the vertices around it are going to get pulled up as well because of this proportional editing tool. Once you left click to save your edit, if you open up the move panel here, you can see that the box for proportional editing is checked. So if you made an edit and decided you didn't want to use proportional editing for that edit, you can turn it off here after. Notice how this is how it would have looked if we hadn't used proportional editing. I'm going to left click to turn it back on, and now we can see more of our proportional editing settings. The proportional size here is the same as the one we had as this menu here, and it will apply to this specific edit we've made. So I can adjust this so I can make it bigger or smaller. So notice as I decrease this, it's going to get more like nothing happened at all as we reach 0. Then as we increase it, more and more is going to get affected until eventually the whole cube will be affected. I'll turn it back to the default, which is 1. Here we also have a setting called proportional fall off, and this is the curve options which we can choose here in the menu. I'm going to demonstrate a few of these. Smooth is the default. We also have sphere. We have root, which you can see is going to create almost like a pointed sphere. We also have sharp, which is going to create more of like a mountain peak effect. We have linear, constant, and random, which could be good if you wanted to pull out some random terrain perhaps. I'll put it back to smooth for now. I'm going to left click a vertex here, and I'm going to press G and Y to put it along the Y axis. And something you can do as well is while I'm moving with proportional editing, I can scroll my mouse wheel to increase that effect size again, which may be a lot more intuitive than editing it after positioning it. So I'll just left click to position it there, and you can notice my proportional size was reduced with the scroll wheel. Next up, I'm going to open up my menu here, and this time I'm going to choose projected from view. Then I'm going to left click one of my vertices on this plane of the face here, and I'm going to left click this green Y symbol here to go into the side view. And now I've got this projected from view on, and I press G and then X and pull out. you can see it's going to pull everything out along that plane. So it's almost being projected, and you can see in the move box it says projected 2D because you're essentially projecting it across the kind of viewing axis. And also if you do it without flattening your view, and I press G and Y, you can notice we can get some kind of interesting effects as well. So this projected option can be quite useful in some cases. Next up we have connected only. I'm going to turn off my projected from view and turn on my connected only, and this time I'm going to left click on my vertices, and when I press G and X you're going to notice no immediate difference. And that's because this connected only really applies when you have multiple separated collections of polygons within your one object. So I'll press Shift A and then I'm going to choose cube, and this is going to add a cube inside of my object in edit mode. So this won't be creating a brand new object, but it's more like an extension of the object we're editing. And then I'm going to press G and X to move this along. Now you'll notice if I left click on my vertices, press G and then X to move it, that is not going to affect this cube beside it, even though these are the same object. However, if I left click this button here and then turn off connected only and press G and then X, and then increase my radius, you'll notice it's going to start influencing the cube beside it as well. And you'll notice when I finish here and turn on connected again, it's not going to affect our cube beside it anymore. And that just about covers the proportional editing tool inside a Blender. Today we're going to be talking about the shrink and fatten tool inside a Blender while we're editing our objects. So I'm going to press Shift A and then under mesh I'm going to choose cylinder, and that will add a cylinder into our scene. Then I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to press 3 on the keyboard and then alt left click to select this face loop here. Then I'm going to come to my toolbar here and scroll down to the bottom where we have this shrink and fatten tool, and I can left click it here, and then I can hold down this yellow circle button here and move it to shrink or fatten our object. And you can notice that rather than scale our object, this will make our selected loop wider or thinner. If I come back to my select box again, which is the default, you can also access this command by pressing Alt and then S. So instead of S for scale, it's Alt S to shrink or fatten. I'll left click to save that edit, and I'm going to left click this face here and press E to extrude, and maybe I'll press S to scale it down, and then maybe G to move it along, and I'll press Alt left click to select this face again and press Alt S, and now you can really see how useful this tool can be while we're modeling inside a Blender. Perhaps if I wanted to decrease the diameter of a certain cylindrical object while modeling. And yeah, a very simple tool, but a handy one which you'll end up using a lot while modeling. So I thought I would share it with you today. Quads, tris and n-gons. Which type of polygon is best to 3D model with? Over the past few years of teaching Blender online, this is a confusion I've seen a lot. So today I thought I'd put your confusion to rest and explain the difference between what these polygons are and which ones you should use while 3D modeling in Blender. Let's get started. This here is a tri, and as you can see, if I press tab to go into edit mode, it is made up of 3 edges, creating a triangle, and they're known as tris for short. Tris are, from what I can understand, are what render engines work with. For example, when you export a 3D model, such as to use in a game engine, you will find all the quads and n-gons will be turned into tris. We'll talk more about quads and n-gons later, but essentially a quad is a face with 4 edges, and an n-gon is a face with 5 or more edges. But yeah, this is why 3D modelers sometimes recommend to triangulate your model before exporting it, just in case it gets turned into tris in a way you don't like, if you were modeling with quads, for example. Let's talk more about quads though. This here is a quad, and if I press tab to go into edit mode, you can see, like I mentioned earlier, it is made up of 4 edges. Quads are the easiest to model with, especially since they work with some important Blender shortcuts, such as selecting loops for example. If I go into edit mode with this object I've made here, press 3 on the keyboard to go into face select mode, and then press alt left click, you can see it can select this entire loop here. It would also work with edges and vertices too. However, I'm going to keep this selected and I'll right click and then press triangulate faces. It's not going to allow us to select this loop anymore because of the tris. So even though tris are the final form of all topology in 3D, for modeling it means we can't use some of our tools in Blender. Another one we can't use would be adding loops. For example, adding a loop cut. If I press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, you can see I can add it over my quad loop here, but I can add it over our tris here. So for that reason, modeling with quads is a lot better than modeling with tris. You also find that quads work a lot better with some of the modifiers in Blender. For example, the subdivision surface modifier. You can see on this cube here that I've added, it's just a normal cube. If I press tab into edit mode, you can see. I'm just going to left click my blue spanner here to go into modifier properties, press add modifier, then under generate, I'll choose subdivision surface. You can see that the modifier will work just fine and as expected. But if I was to press tab to go into edit mode, left click this top face here, right click and then triangulate my faces, you can see straight away that the shape of our subdivision surface has changed on the top, as it's now turning this triangle into 3 quads and then subdividing it from there, rather than just working off the quad we had. You also notice if I press Shift A, then under mesh I'll choose cylinder, and I'll go to add modifier and then choose subdivision surface. it's going to kind of freak out here, and that's because the subdivision surface is trying to break this engon on the top. If I press tab to go into edit mode, this engon on the top into quads, and it's creating this mess as a result. Thankfully though, an easy way to fix this would just be to left click our top face and press I to inset. Then I could press I to inset again if I'm still having some issues, and that's fixed that up for the most part. While quads are great for modeling, sometimes when making a model which is going to be animated, a couple of tries can be used to improve the way the model bends during animation. This mainly applies to low poly characters at the joint points and things like that. To summarize though, quads are best for modeling, as modeling with just tries would be painfully slow since a lot of the tools and modifiers wouldn't work. But that's not to say you can never use tries, as they do have some use cases. For example, when creating a low poly character to be animated. An engon is just any face with 5 or more edges. As you might imagine, for reasons we talked about earlier, you may prefer to model with quads. However, for hard surface modeling, which is modeling models that don't deform and keep their shape, for example doors, tables, canisters, and things like that, sometimes it can be faster to model with engons, and then clean up your topology later if you're having shading issues or in order to prepare for exporting. But for us, we are going to be modeling our first object, this table here, using the quad-based workflow, as I think it's a good place to start for beginners, and it's important to understand the concepts behind quad-based modeling first. However, I do hope to talk about using engons for hard surface modeling in the future. And yeah, that just about covers an introduction for the 3 different types of polygons in 3D, and of course Blender. Awesome job, that's you gone ahead and learned the most important 3D modeling tools you'll be using all the time whilst you 3D model. But now we know all of these different tools, we need to go ahead and put these skills into practice, and to do that we're going to be quad modeling this simple table here. If you forgot what a quad is, it's just a face with 4 edges. So all I mean by quad modeling is that this table will be made just out of these 4 edged faces. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Hey everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how you can model a basic table a bit like this inside of Blender. If you want to use this table as a reference for modeling this table, you can download the file in the description below to follow along. For now, I'll just press G and X with my object selected, and I'm just going to move it along. Then I'm going to press Shift A, and under Mesh I'm going to choose Cube. I'm then going to use the S key, which allows me to scale an object. So think of it as S for scale. Then I'll just size it down by moving my mouse, and you can see I can adjust the size of my object very easily this way. However, I want to squish it down to make this top part of the table here. To do that, I can scale it on just one axis. Notice here, this gizmo here showcases a Z, a Y, and an X axis. So you can see the Z axis is this blue up and down axis. So to squish it that way, all I need to do is press S and then choose Z. So think of it as scaling it or changing the size of it with S, and then choosing Z to squish it on that Z axis. I'll just move my mouse until I'm kind of happy with the size. I can also view my object straight on by left clicking one of these circles here. So for example, if I press this blue Z circle, it's going to view the top view. To view this one of the sides, I can choose one of these green circles, and the good thing about this is it's laptop friendly as well. I can also move my object by pressing G, so think of it as G for grab, and I'm going to choose Z to move it up on that Z axis. Then I can press S and Z again just to scale it so it's roughly the same size. I'm not going to go for a perfect replica here, but if you want to, then you can just overlap these objects to get the perfect proportions. You'll notice though, the top part of our table is still pretty square, and I went for a more rectangle shape. So to fix that, I'm going to then press the S key again for scale, and this time I'll choose Y, which will allow me to scale it across the Y axis, which is that green line. I'll move it to about there. Again, I can left click this red circle this time to see how it's looking on this view. So I'll press S and then Y again, and you can see I've actually lined it up pretty accurately there. For the next part, we're going to use a handy add-on so we can quickly add a mirror modifier, which is going to allow us to edit our object a little quicker. The mirror modifier isn't an add-on, but what this add-on will do is allow us to apply it very quickly and save us a bit of time. So to add this add-on, all I'm going to do is go to Edit and then go to Preferences. If you're in Blender 4.1 or earlier, you can go to this menu called Add-ons, and here you would just be able to search for mirror and it would show up in here. However, in Blender 4.2, we now use the extensions option, which means we have to install it from the internet first. So I'll go to Get Extensions, and in Get Extensions, I'm going to search for mirror. Then where it says Auto Mirror, we can just choose Install. Once it finishes, you'll see it is gone like this, and you can find out more information on this website here. Then I'll go to Add-ons, and I can then search for mirror, and you can see we have it here. Now we've added that add-on, all I need to do is press N, and that's going to open up this side panel. I can then scroll all the way down to my edit option in the side panel, and here you'll see an option called auto mirror. I can open up this menu, And here we've got some settings. But before we do that, we first need to apply the scale, as we've done some scaling inside of object. If you don't know anything about applying the scale, make sure to check out my video where I explain why it is so important. To apply the scale, all I need to do is press Ctrl and then A, and this will open the apply menu. Then I can just choose scale. And now all I can do is, you can see in auto mirror we have a few options. There's X, Y and Z. The ones we're only needing today is X and Y. So first I'll choose X, and then I'm going to choose auto mirror. Now when I go into edit mode, which you go into by pressing tab on the keyboard, you'll notice that only half of our table can actually be selected. And you'll notice if I select one of these faces, so I'll press 3 on the keyboard to go into face select mode and left click this face to select it and then press G, you'll notice how it's going to move both sides at the same time. I'm going to press tab to go back into object mode, and I'm going to take this a step further by mirroring the Y axis too, since we're going to be pulling down these legs and we have 4 of them, so we might as well do all sides at once. So I'll left click the Y this time and then press auto mirror. Then when I press tab to go into edit mode, you can see I've now got just one face, and when I move it, it's going to move all those faces at the same time. If I come down to this blue spanner option here, which is called modifier properties, you can see 2 modifiers have been added, and these are the mirror modifiers which I told you about. For now, we can just leave them as they are. To start off, I'm going to add some loop cuts. A loop cut is pretty much just a bunch of edges which go through the center of a certain set of faces. So I'll press Ctrl R, which is the hotkey for loop cut, and you can see here I can choose where I want to place it. I'm going to place one here to start with, so I'll just left click here, and then I'm going to press Ctrl R again, and I'm going to left click here too. Then if you want to move a loop cut, you can first of all select it by pressing Alt left click on the loop cut, making sure you're in edge select mode still, which is 2 on the keyboard, and then we can press G twice, so G and then G, and that's going to allow you to slide it along. I'm going to move it to roughly where the center of the leg will be, so I'm going to left click this blue circle again so I can see it from the bottom view. I'll then press Alt left click on the other loop we created and press G twice to move this one down. Now I'll press Shift Alt left click and select this loop. Shift Alt left click allows you to select multiple loops at once. And then we're going to be using a command called Bevel. So to do that, I'm going to press Ctrl and then B, and that's going to allow me to create this effect here. And here, this square here is going to become our leg. But you'll notice a leg is not the only thing I created. I also created a little connecting piece in between, so I'll show you how I created that as well. I'll left click this blue circle again to go into the bottom view, and this time I'm going to press Ctrl R again and create a new loop cut in the middle. I'll then press Ctrl R once more and create another loop cut through this center as well. Just left click to place it and right click to keep it in the middle. Then I'll press Shift Alt left click to select this loop as well, and I'm going to press Ctrl B and I'm going to scale it up to roughly where I had it, and that's going to be so we can select this middle connecting part here as well. Great, now we have everything, we just need to select everything and then extrude it. Extruding is the process of just pretty much bringing out geometry. So to do that, I'm going to go into face select. So I'll press 3 on the keyboard, and then I'm going to left click this face here, shift left click this face here, then I'm going to shift left click this face here, and we can do Control Shift left click and then choose the opposite corner to select this entire set of faces. Now I've got all those selected, I'm going to go ahead and press this red circle here to go into the side view, and I'll press E, which is going to allow me to extrude, and I can just pull this down to roughly about here. Now when I rotate around, you can see we've got the first part of our table, and now all we have to do is the leg. So as you might have guessed, we just need to select these faces here. We can do that Control Shift left click again, and even though we don't have any other faces selected, we still need to do Control Shift left. So I'll press Control Shift and then left click, and that's going to select that entire face. Then I'll go into my side view again by pressing this green circle, and then press E and then Z just to pull this down. Z will allow me to lock it to this Z axis. And there, now we have modeled our table successfully. You can see I made these legs a little bit chunkier than the other one. You can of course still make these thinner if you like, and to do that all we need to do is press Alt left click on this set of faces here. Again, is faces, so make sure you press 3 on the keyboard in edit mode to go into face select mode. Then I can press Shift Alt left click on this set of faces here. We'll need to get the inside ones as well, so I'll press Shift Alt left click on this set of faces here. Then I can just Shift left click the rest of the faces around here, and I'll press Shift left click and then Shift Control left click to select this bottom set of faces here. And this time we can press S to scale, and we'll choose Shift Z. What this will do is it will use every axis apart from the Z axis. So that means only the X and Y axis will be scaled on, and I can just scale things down that way. And you can see we've got much thinner legs now. If you don't like how all of these edges have gone skewed though, there's an easy way you can fix that too. I'll press 2 on the keyboard and press left click on this edge here, and I'll select the ones on the other side with just shift left click and then control left click. Control left click just allows you to select in a row like that using the pick shortest path. Then I'm wanting to line it up with this edge here, so I'll shift left click this one and then shift left click it again, so you can see how the edge has gone white, which means it's the active selection. Then if we wanted to flatten this out, we could do it by pressing S, Y and then 0, but you'll notice it's just going to average it out in the middle, which isn't what we want. But we want to flatten it out using this edge here as a reference point. So to do that, I can come up to my transform pivot point and then choose active element. Now when I press S, Y and then 0, you can see it flattens out that way, and now we have a nice straight line again. I can of course do this for the other ones as well, so I could shift left click those ones there, and then I can press control left click to select the rest of these edges. Then I'll shift select one of my edges here to use it as a reference, and I can press S, X, and then 0. You notice it'll create a bit of overlap here, but we can fix that by simply just repeating the process. I'll left click that edge there, and I'm going to control left click it up here. Then I'll shift left click this edge here, and I'm going to then press S, X, and then 0. And that's going to flatten it out. And you can repeat that process for as many edges as you want to straighten out. So that's a great way to give you a little bit of cleaner topology as you're working. I want you to go ahead and try and finish this process on your own, and I'll get back to you when we're done. And there, now we've straightened out all of our edges successfully. This will help make sure we have nice clean bevels later as well. Hey everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how we can add an extra little bit of realism to our hard surface objects inside a Blender. Here you can see we have a table which we actually made in the last episode of my Blender Modeling for Absolute Beginners series. And just before we move into the tip, I'm going to do a quick 30-second cleanup. So if you want to follow along with that, make sure to check out the tutorial here in the top right hand corner. With this table we made in the last tutorial, you can see that inside of edit mode, which we press tab to go into for object selected, only have a quarter of our table is here, and that's because last time we used some mirror modifiers to repeat this everywhere. Before I make any permanent changes to my table, I'm going to press tab to come back into object mode, and I'm going to press shift and then D to duplicate our table. I can then come up to the top right hand corner, and I can hide my table by pressing the eye symbol and the camera symbol. If you can't see these options, there's a little filter button up here, and this allows you to see what you can see inside of this outliner menu. So you can just turn on the eye symbol and the camera symbol, and then you should be able to turn these off. We also haven't named things properly, so I'm just going to go ahead and name this table spare. And I'm going to call my other table table. Then now we have a spare set up just in case. I'm going to go ahead and come to my mirror modifiers here, left click the drop down and then choose apply, and then I'm going to apply the second one as well by left clicking the drop down and choosing apply. Now when I press tab to go into edit mode, you can see we have our table with all of its mirror applied. I'm also going to get rid of a couple of unnecessary edge loops. You could do a bit more cleanup if you wanted to optimize this for maybe a game engine for example, but we're just going to do a simple cleanup and remove the things which are absolutely unnecessary, which are these two sets of loops here. So I can just press alt left click on this edge loop here, and then shift alt left click on this edge loop here. And now I want to delete these because they're unnecessary. So I'm going to press Control X, and rather than X, which will delete it, Control X will dissolve it, meaning it won't ruin any of our other topology. Now what we're wanting to do is we want to make our edges a little bit more realistic, because right now they're very sharp, like almost infinitely sharp, and this is just not going to look very realistic. You notice that the example table to the left here has a little bit more of a realistic edge, and what this actually is a bevel modifier, which is adding a really small bevel, because even though this might be quite a sharp edge, it's not going to be perfectly sharp, so a little bit of smoothness is a little bit more realistic, and it will make a difference in your renders. So if you've watched my why you should apply the scale video before, you will know that the first thing we should do before applying any modifiers to make sure they work correctly is apply the scale. So to do this, I just need to left click my object, press Ctrl and then A to open the apply menu, and then just choose scale. And that's going to make sure that the modifier has no issues when it's being applied to our object. Now I'm going to left click this blue spanner icon here, which is my modifier properties menu, and I'm just going to choose add modifier. Then I'm going to come to generate, and under here we can choose bevel, and you can see to start it's created some pretty big bevels, and we're going to want to make this a bit smaller, so I'm going to change this to something like 0.0025. You can see if I zoom in here, that's created a much nicer, smaller bevel. You can see if I open my side panel by pressing N, you can see that I've actually modeled my table based on kind of realistic dimensions. So if your dimensions are similar to mine, you should be able to apply a similar amount here in the amount parameter on the bevel modifier to get a similar result to me. Changing the dimension of your object is easy. All you need to do is press S to scale it, and then once you've finished scaling it, you can just apply the scale again by pressing Ctrl A and then choosing scale. If I zoom in though, you can see from a distance, although our edges look alright, when I zoom in, it's not looking very good. So all we need to do is actually increase the number of bevels we have. So I'm going to change the segments to maybe a number like 3 or 4, and that's going to look a little bit more realistic. Then you can still see the jaggedness of the transition, so all we need to do is right click, and if we're in Blender 4.2, we can just choose Shade Auto Smooth. If you're in Blender 4.1, it might be Shade Smooth by Angle, and if you're in Blender 4.0 or earlier, it'll be Shade Auto Smooth again. This has worked, but you can see we have a little bit of shading issues on here, and that's to do with the bevel, not the Shade Auto Smooth. So I'm going to open up the shading tab on my bevel modifier, and here I'm going to choose Harden Normals, and you can see that fixes that up nicely. And yeah, there we go, that has made some more realistic looking edges for our hard surface model. In our case, this table we made. Awesome job on completing the table project. Now you should be ready to go ahead and move on to learning some of the extra modeling tools in Blender, which are definitely going to save you a ton of time when working on complex projects in Blender. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Not long now until we've completed the course. Hey everyone, today we're going to be learning more about the Inset tool inside of Blender. To get started, I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cube, then I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit mode, A to select everything, and then I'm going to right click, and then choose Subdivide, and in the bottom left hand corner, a little menu called Subdivide will appear, so I'll just left click to open it, and I'm going to change my number of cuts to something like 8. And now we have a little bit more geometry to play around with. I'm going to press 3 on the keyboard to go into Face Select mode, and I'm going to scroll down to this option here called Inset Faces. Then I'm just going to left click a face here, and then I'm going to press Shift Control left click to select this entire set of faces here. Now what I can do is I can left click this tool here, and now when I hold down the circle, you can see that's going to allow me to inset. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that, because some of you might already know that we can also press the I key to inset, and we don't need to be in the Inset tool to do this. I'll right click to cancel that operation. At the top here with the Inset tool selected, you can see we've got a few options, such as Outset, Individual, Offset Even, Offset Relative, and these options can be found without using this tool in the toolbar as well. So I don't like to use the toolbar, so I'm going to left click my select box again, and this time I'm just going to press I. And when I left click to save my inset and open my Inset Faces menu, you can see we've got all those options I was talking about here. Thickness was just how much we moved our mouse, so you can see as I increase or decrease this, it allows us to manually adjust the edit we just made. Then we have this parameter called depth, and this will actually push our inset in or out. So you can see it's pushing this along the y-axis, either inwards or outwards. And if you want to reset it to the default, you can just turn it back down to 0. Next we have individual. Notice when I left click this, we'll have a bunch of faces that have been insetted, and if I alter my thickness here, you can see what it's pretty much doing is it's taking all these faces and insetting them individually. I'm going to turn off the individual for now and press Ctrl Z to undo the inset, and now when I press I can actually press I again, and now that's going to allow me to inset individual using a hotkey. I'll press left click to save that, and of course if you wanted to turn it off again, you could just turn it off in this Inset Faces menu once you're finished and change your mind. Next up we have Select Outer, and when I left click this, you can notice that the faces we now have selected are the ones on the outside. This might be handy if you then wanted to perform an operation on these faces here, so you could quickly doing it using this Inset Faces menu here. I'll turn that off for now. Next up we have Outset. It's a little hard to see, but if I increase the thickness, you can see a loop is being pushed along there. And essentially what it's doing is rather than creating a loop inside this face, it's creating a loop on the outside. To better demonstrate this, I'm actually going to add a cylinder. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then I'm going to add cylinder, and I'm going to press G and X to move this cylinder along. This isn't a separate object, it's actually part of this cube since I added it in edit mode, but for now it doesn't really matter. I'm going to press Alt left click, and I'm still in face select mode, which is 3 on the keyboard, and that's going to select this entire loop here. Then I can press I, and I'm just going to left click because I'm going to change the settings here. So I'm going to turn off the individual option, and you'll see once I have the outset on, when I adjust the thickness, it's actually going to inset that top face instead because it's on the outside of the selected loop. As for this Offset Relative tool, I don't really tend to use it, so I'm not really going to talk about it today. And yeah, that covers some of the other tools inside of the Inset tool, which I sometimes use. Hey everyone, today we're going to be learning about the spin tool in Blender. So I'm going to start off by pressing Shift and then A, and then under Mesh I'm going to choose Circle. Then I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit mode, and I'll press 1 on the keyboard to go into Vertex Select mode. And you can see what Circle has done is just added a plain circle with no faces and just vertices. Then I'll scroll down my toolbar here, and here we have a tool called the Spin tool. This one doesn't have a hotkey as far as I'm aware, so I usually just use it in the toolbar. you'll see straight away that a big curved tool here has appeared, and this is going to allow us to actually perform the spin operation. You also notice at the top here, we have an X, Y, and Z option, and this allows us to determine how we're going to use the spin tool. Let's say I want to make my circle spin around to the right here. For that, I would need to choose a different axis, so I'm going to choose the Y axis. And that's going to allow me to spin it in this direction. Notice how when I left click and hold, we're now spinning it this way. But the problem is it's kind of stuck in the center here, and it's not kind of creating a round curved tube like I'm wanting. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that. And the most important thing to understand about the spin tool is it's determined by this 3D cursor. So as you know, you can move your 3D cursor using the Shift S menu, which allows you to move your cursor to either things you have selected or back to the center of the world. And you can also move it manually by pressing Shift right click. And you can see as I've moved my cursor there, the spin tool has changed. And now if I was to left click and hold it, you can see it's going to be spinning it around that point that I've created. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. And something you'll notice is if you try to press Ctrl Z to return your cursor to the center, it won't work. Instead, to return your cursor to the center, you have to press Shift and then S, and then choose Cursor to World Origin. Another thing we can do is we can move the geometry itself instead of the 3D cursor. So I can press A to select my entire circle, and then G and then X, for example, and then I'll just move my circle along, and now we have our cursor in the center, and we have our circle to the left here. Now I can left click and hold my spin tool here, and as I left click and drag, it's just going to spin around the center like that, which works nicely for us. Once you've completed your spin operation, you can open this spin menu here to make some adjustments to your settings. For example, I could change my steps, so if I turn this down, you're going to notice it's going to create less geometry in between our spin. And obviously if I increase this to maybe something like 32, you can see we now have a nice smooth looking donut. Angle is just how far the spin went, so as you might imagine, if I change this to 360, it's going to overlap back with the original circle, which could be good if you want to create a complete donut like this. You'll also notice there's this auto merge tool here, and that means when the vertices are overlapping, they will be joined together, which is really handy. Flip normals, if you're familiar with what normals are in Blender, it's going to change the direction of the normals of these faces. The reason why this tool is here in the first place is because if I come up to my overlays option and in the drop down I turn on face orientation, you can see for whatever reason when I've done the spin tool on this circle, the normals have become the wrong way around, which can sometimes happen. So the Blender developers added this flip normals option, so when this happens you can easily just turn it back on, and that will save you having to go and correct the normals later. You can see we can also adjust the center, which is that where the 3D cursor is, and the axis after we've finished editing as well. The last tool we have is use duplicates, and if I turn this on, you're going to see nothing is going to be connected now, as it's just going to duplicate our entire object. I'll press tab to come back into object mode, and I'll press G and X to move my object along, and I'm going to press Shift A, and then under mesh, I'm going to choose cylinder. If you want to turn off this normal direction, you can come up to your overlays and then turn off the face orientation. Just make sure to check it whenever you change something. Then I'll press tab to come into edit mode, and I'm going to press G and X to move my cylinder along. And this time I'm going to choose the Z axis because I want to make a bunch of duplicated cylinders going around in a circle. So I'm just going to left click and drag the tool, and you can see by default, since I had the entire cylinder selected, it's created a bit of a mess for us. But if I change this to use duplicates, and then I maybe change the number to something a bit lower, like 12, maybe even lower than that, maybe let's go for 8, you can see I've got a bunch of cylinders going in a circle. And I can change it to 360. Now we got a perfect circle of cylinders. So that's the usefulness of the use duplicates tool. I'll press tab to come back into object mode, and yeah, that pretty much covers the basics of how to use the spin tool in Blender. As you can imagine, it can be quite useful for quite a few cases, as long as you understand that it's based around this 3D cursor. Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you about the Rip Region tool, which will allow you to separate out your object in Blender. To show you what I mean, I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh I'm going to choose Cube. Then I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit mode, and I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard to go into Vertex Selector mode. Then I'm going to left click one of the vertices which I want to separate out. Then we can just scroll down to the bottom here where we have this option called Rip Region. So I'll left click it, and now you'll notice when I select one of the vertices, this yellow circle will appear, and if I left click and hold it, you can see I can pull out this vertex, and now it's been separated into 2 separate vertices. There's also a handy hotkey for this if you'd prefer to use that instead of the tool on the toolbar. So I'll come back to my select box, which is the default on the toolbar, and I'm going to left click one of my vertices, and instead I can just press V, and that will allow me to pull these vertices apart like this. So you could think of that V as snapping apart like a pair of scissors, since it's kind of in the shape of scissors. So I'll try again. I'll left click on my vertices and press V, and you see it will separate out nicely. I'll press enter to save that edit. And yeah, that's just about it. This rip region tool can be really useful to have in your Blender tool belt. I remember quite a few cases when I started Blender where I would have loved to have known this tool, but I had no idea it even existed, so definitely a good one to know about early on in your Blender journey. Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to use the local view in Blender, which is really useful when you're modeling. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh I'm going to choose Cylinder, and I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh I'm going to choose Cube as well. And then I'm going to press G and Y to move that selected cube along the Y axis. To use the local view, we can just come up to View here, and here you can see there's an option called Local View, and then I can just press Toggle Local View. You can see that's zoomed into my object here. To come out of it, we can just come back to View, and then under Local View, we can just choose Toggle Local View to come back out. So why is this useful? Well, let's say you have a collection of a lot of objects. This would be a great way to zoom in and focus on just that one object at a time. I use it all the time when I'm modeling, so I'd highly recommend practicing it to get used to it. But a better way to practice this is not by coming up to View and Local View and then Toggle Local View, but rather to use the hotkey, which is just the / key on the computer. So if you come to your keyboard and just press the / key, you can see I'm going to toggle in and out of this local view. Also, if I shift left click my cylinder here, I can press the / and now both of these objects will be in the local view. So if I had more objects, the other objects would be excluded. If I press tab to go into edit mode, you can also use the local view in here as well if you just wanted to hide all the other objects in your scene. Hey everyone, today we're going to be learning about the Shear tool in Blender and how you can use it to speed up your modeling process. To start off, I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cube, and we're going to play around with this object. Then I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit mode, and if I come to my toolbar here on the left and scroll down, at the bottom here we have a tool called Shear. I'll left click it to enable it, and now you'll see this tool has appeared. To use the Shear tool, we usually do it with just one face or one plane of faces at a time. So I'm just going to press free on the keyboard to go into face select mode, and left click this face here. Then to use this tool, all we need to do is left click and hold one of these bars here, and you can just pull it, and you can see that that's going to shear like that. You'll notice that once we complete a shear operation by left clicking, I can open up this menu in the bottom left hand corner, which has some options here. You'll notice the first thing we see is offset, and if you want to make it a perfect 45-degree angle, you can just set it to 1 or -1 respectively. So in this case, I'm going to choose -1, and you can see that's going to create a perfect 45-degree angle for us. And why this is useful is I could then press E for extrude and choose Z and just pull this up. And you can see how this can be really handy while modeling. Maybe press E and then X for example, and pull this along. And if I wanted to flatten this face here, I could just press S, X, and then 0. That's going to scale that face and then flatten it across the x-axis, neutralizing it. As you guys probably know if you've been watching this series, I don't really like to use the toolbar and like to use hotkeys instead. So I'm going to come to the top and go back to my select box. And we can use this shear tool by pressing Shift, Control, Alt, S. And you can see once I do that, it's going to start shearing. But you can see we're having a bit of issues. It's kind of just shearing randomly. So for example, if I want to shear it this way, I could go in this view, so I could Control Alt S, and you can see that's going to allow me to easily shear. And you can also type in the number 1 if you just want to put it straight to that 45-degree angle, and press enter. And now you see when I rotate around, that's created it how we were wanting it. And just to quickly explain here, this will work with any object. So I can, for example, press Shift A, and then this time I'm going to choose a cylinder. I'm in object mode here, but if you're in edit mode, it's not the end of the world. Since this is just a quick example, just keep in mind if you do this in edit mode, it's going to be joined to our other object. Then I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode, and press free on the keyboard to go in face select mode, and I'll left click this top face here, and I can go into my side view here by just left clicking the green Y symbol, and I'll press Shift, Control, Alt, S, and you'll notice nothing's really happening here. And sometimes all we need to do is just tell it what axis to do this on. So since we're viewing it from the Y axis, I can just press Y. And now you notice the shear works properly. I'm just going to type in the number 1 and press enter. And then I could press E and X for example, and I could start making a kind of pipe shape here. So yeah, a really simple but handy tool to have in your modeling tool belt for modeling in Blender. Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to use the 2-sphere tool inside of Blender. It's really straightforward, so let's get straight into it. I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Mesh I'm going to choose Cube. Then I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit mode, and I'm then going to scroll down my toolbar here to the Shear command. And this time I'm just going to left click and hold it, and you can see we have another option called 2-sphere. So I'm going to change to that, and right now if I left click and drag, you can see that nothing's really going to happen. And that's because we don't actually have enough geometry. So I'm going to press A to select everything, right click, and I'm going to choose Subdivide. Then I'm going to come to my menu in the bottom left hand corner, and where it says number of cuts, I'm just going to increase it to a bigger number, maybe like 6. Now when I left click and hold, you can see that our 2sphere command is going to start working, and that's going to turn this cube shape into a sphere. You can see once we finish doing it, the 2sphere box will be here, and here we can determine the factor. Notice if I decrease this, I can get a more kind of bloated cube, and then eventually I get my sphere. I'm going to take it down to 0, and I'm going to show you the hotkey for this. So instead of using the tool, we can use the hotkey. So I'll come back up to my select box, which is the default, and then I can just press Shift Alt S, and that's going to access that 2sphere command without having to use the tool on the toolbar. Congratulations, you just gone ahead and completed this entire course of Blender modeling for absolute beginners. Hopefully you should have built up some confidence to go ahead and start 3D modeling your own models. But of course, don't be afraid to come back to this video and refresh on certain areas if you're feeling a bit lost. Doing this will also help you solidify your knowledge and keep you on track to becoming a brilliant 3D modeler. There will also be more 3D modeling videos coming out on the channel. For example, I'm doing a few videos on Subdividing modeling, which is a specific 3D modeling workflow which I think you guys would be really interested in if you enjoyed this course. But apart from that, I'd like to congratulate you again for completing this course, and thank you for watching. I hope you found this Blender course useful, and that it either got you started with modeling in Blender, or you learned a few additional tricks to add to your Blender modeling workflow. Apart from that, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next free course or tutorial. Take care.